Oh hey, a new Folding Ideas video. Oh, and it's on NFTs? Fantastic, let's rip these NFTs apart. Let's fucking do this. Get me a little snack and let's do it.
Into this environment in 2009 arrived Bitcoin, poorly designed or deliberately obtuse,
A sexy man I always
Rap crypto, yo!
the hobby horse of a few 100,000 gambling addicts.
Holy shit. Alright, I'm going to assume that you've already seen the original video and have that context so you know what I'm talking about. To be clear before we start, I'm going to be specifically addressing the arguments relating to crypto and not really so much the stuff about NFTs because, to be clear, I largely agree with the idea that NFTs in their current implementation are bunk, and I'm not necessarily a big NFT fan. That much, there's parts of the video that I actually very much agree with, and we'll go over that. There are times when my criticisms are going to be more intense than his, but in general, this is largely a straight rebuttal. So, what is wrong or incomplete or misleading about the Folding Ideas take on crypto? Let's find out. After a really nice preamble that breaks down the great financial crisis, he gets into the crypto part, and naturally this story begins with Bitcoin. So he starts off with the description of crypto terminology, which I take no issue with.
Bitcoin was structurally too slow and expensive to handle regular commerce.
Now, this is absolutely true for Bitcoin Layer 1. However, Layer 2 innovations, which we'll talk about extensively in this video, seek to overcome this hurdle. Note that I personally disagree with the move towards medium of exchange at this time for exactly this reason, and more that we'll talk about later. I don't think Bitcoin being used as a medium of exchange and unit of account in a national economy makes a lot of sense. More on this when we get to deflation.
The whole thing basically came out the gate as a speculative financial vehicle, and so the only consumer market that proved to be a viable use was buying and selling prohibited drugs, where the high fees, rapid price fluctuations, and multi-hour transaction times were mitigated by receiving LSD in the mail a week later.
Each of these has on-chain and off-chain solutions, as these are all known problems that Bitcoin developers have obviously noticed. So with regard to high fees, SegWit is a way of removing transaction signatures to circumvent size limitations and to lower fees. By reducing the malleability of transaction IDs, SegWit also enables Lightning Network, which can both reduce transaction times and fees by allowing multiple near-instant transactions to occur via state channels at much lower fees. More detail on this later. These are just some beginning examples about how Layer 1 and Layer 2 solutions can ameliorate issues with the OG Bitcoin Core protocol. With regard to rapid price fluctuations, this is something I addressed in a previous video about the case for crypto in the modern day. This was and is an issue when we're talking about Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, or really any crypto as a medium of exchange, other than a stablecoin, of course. If you're really married to the idea of Bitcoin as currency, the argument you'd likely use here is that the volatility of Bitcoin over time has been declining over the last decade or so. And once we get to larger market caps, the price will largely stabilize. This is just the idea that Bitcoin will be a good currency at some point in the future if you just buy in harder. This is a pretty theoretical argument that might not come adequately to fruition in our lifetimes, as the Bitcoin mining process won't conclude until 2140 or so, and we really don't know what market cap will bring an acceptable level of volatility. We'll talk about the parameters that would define acceptable when we get to the deflation part. This particular downfall is one that's cited as one fundamental reason for the forking of Bitcoin SV, which actually geared more towards the use of crypto as a medium of exchange. Looking at Bitcoin SV's price chart, the argument for its success is a bit tenuous, but the argument could be made either way. There's still fluctuations, but it tends to settle around the $100 mark long term, which minimizes its utility as a tool for speculation or store of value, but makes a more reasonable medium of exchange. The issue of multi-hour transaction times is something that we're going to address in much more detail later when we get to Lightning Network, at least with regard to Bitcoin. Although I will say that I've never actually had a Bitcoin transaction actually take multiple hours, but I've heard it happens. We'll give some context to this when we talk about shipping.
And as far as banking is concerned, Bitcoin was never designed to solve the actual problems created by the banking industry, only to be the new medium by which they operated.
This one is pretty questionable, but we'll let the next part play out so that we frame his argument fairly before we break it down into parts.
The principal offering was a revolution, but at best a changing of the guard. The gripe is not with the outcomes of 2008, but the fact that you had to be well connected in order to get in on the grift in 2006. And even the change of the guard is an illusion. Jews. Some of the largest institutional holders of cryptocurrency are the exact same investment banks that created the subprime loan crash. Rather than being a reprieve to the people harmed by the housing bubble, the people whose savings and retirements were unknown to them, being gambled on smoke, cryptocurrency instantly became the new playground for smoke vendors.
Okay, so he starts off saying that a lot of the same players have gotten into crypto, but his understanding of the timeline is a bit skewed. The same people instantly got into Bitcoin? Spoken like somebody who only started paying attention recently. It would seem that way if you got onto the crypto Twitter of today and saw the likes of Peter Thiel and Andreessen Horowitz and Goldman Sachs getting into Bitcoin. Now, when it comes to the individuals he points to here, I don't actually think this is a particularly salient argument the way he makes it here, just because, saying that Tyler Winklevoss is involved seems more like a guilt by association type of argument, as it doesn't necessarily speak to the type of market their presence is cultivating, unless you can point to concrete ways in which their influence is systematically polarizing the market or otherwise distorting the Bitcoin market or the crypto market more generally. Not saying that you couldn't do that, only that he doesn't. I, however, will in a few minutes, so hold tight. That being said, let's go ahead and talk about some of the examples that were given. If you go back only a few years, you'll find that Peter Thiel didn't think Bitcoin was viable as recently as 2014, and today admits to having underinvested in it. And it strikes me as pretty natural for Thiel specifically to get in on Bitcoin or cryptocurrency more generally, as it's marketed as the type of platform that would basically obviate a legacy payment system like PayPal. If a future technology is slated to crush his company, he'd be an idiot not to try and take any opportunity to ride that wave up, which he didn't until the price was already massive. So now we're living in a world where this billionaire is a potential bag holder to entire strata of Bitcoin investors. At this point, 2022, PayPal has actually announced that it's seriously looking into the development and release of a PayPal stablecoin, with the potential next step for their company being a big push into crypto. As for the eugenics and racist stuff, that's pretty messed up, but not necessarily a part of the spirit of Bitcoin or a central emphasis of the crypto community as a whole. I'm pretty deep into crypto, and this was news to me. Given that Goldman Sachs has within the last year or two gotten in on the action, and Jewish people like, for instance, David Pakman are also into Bitcoin, I think it's fair to say that you can be into cryptocurrency or Bitcoin without hating Jewish bankers. He also talks about old money finance assholes, the Winklevoss twins, and here he rightly says that they were amongst the earlier names that got into Bitcoin. Reportedly, they got in around April 2013, which would put their initial cost basis somewhere between $50 and $260, which is pretty impressive. Now, I might be wrong about this, but it seems that the relevance of their presence in the Bitcoin market stems from them being old money finance types, which is a bit of a stretch. Their father is a self-made finance tycoon who started off as a professor of insurance at a university and as an actuary who started Winklevoss Consultants and Technologies after the twins were born, during their lifetimes. Yes, Daddy was rich, but this hardly makes them old money finance types. The other argument could be that their connections link them inherently to the corruption of 2008 and 2009, which I also think is unfair. As far as I could find, Winklevoss Technologies don't have much involvement in the financial instrument side of things related to the financial crisis and operate more on the software side of finance, in line with Howard Winklevoss's background in actuarial sciences. While it's fair to suggest that this isn't that far off from the industry in question, and their family probably has connections to the problematic investment banks that were involved, Bringing them up here just feels like an emotional appeal to the image built up by Armie Hammer's portrayal of them in the movie The Social Network. I'll put a piece on the Winklevi in the description, and you can decide for yourself. I don't know them well enough, or care enough, to expound on that further here, because once again, I don't think the argument is presented in a way that actually directly links them to any actual wrongdoing in the cryptocurrency market. Once again, you could potentially make that argument, I just don't think he makes that argument. With regard to Jordan Belfort, rightly named a financial criminal here, he didn't really think Bitcoin was viable as recently as 2018, when the price had already reached about $6,000 to $10,000. Jordan Belfort only got crypto magnitude gains at this market cycle, and at the time of the writing of this script, his profits are being dug into pretty good. In fact, he's probably selling to me right now. Once again, though, he's been against crypto longer than he's been for it. Chris Dixon is a bit of an idiot, and frankly, I'm shocked that he's gotten as far in life as he has. With regard to Bitcoin, we don't hold him in particularly high regard. And yes, I mean, he's big into NFTs. And as I said, I don't really disagree with much of Dan's take on NFTs specifically. Now, I do take issue with how he characterizes Coinbase in this particular section, although though this isn't material to the underlying argument here. Coinbase is only the third largest centralized exchange below Binance and FTX, and hardly controls all entries and exits to the crypto economy. But fine, his point is that Chris is a VC connected to the large Web2 companies, and that stands. Now on to the point that
some of the largest institutional holders of cryptocurrency are the exact same investment banks that created the subprime loan crash.
this is currently true. But once again, we have to look at the timelines here, as the true narrative is precisely the opposite of what Dan is trying to get at here. When he says that cryptocurrency instantly became the new playground for these new smoke vendors. The implication is that these entities immediately jumped on the Bitcoin bandwagon because they recognized that this was a new speculative financial instrument that they could use to get rich off of at the expense of common people. In truth, Bitcoin turned 13 this year, and for most of its lifetime so far, it has been reviled by these exact institutions. We forced these banks to start offering crypto services. Indeed, the only reason investment banks started to get in on the action these last few years is because public interest continued to burgeon despite the banks constantly saying on television that it was all a scam. They realized that while they'd missed out on the ground floor, there was enough potential left to at least get in between people and this new asset class by buying large amounts and then essentially gatekeeping it. For them, they are no longer the executioner swinging the axe. They are the sentenced, tipping the executioner to make sure the cut is clean. They put off participation in the crypto market as long as they could because they could see the writing on the wall. And now they might as well ride the wave all the way down. If it goes well, they could maybe even transition into Web3 versions of themselves. And I wouldn't be surprised if they did. But ultimately, a lot of them aren't going to make the cut. And I think they kind of get that by now. Now, let me add a little something to the mix while we're talking about shady players and how their participation, or in this case, lack thereof, reflect on crypto. Let's take a moment to talk about the IMF and the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund was set up after the Second World War at the Bretton Woods Conference to manage the global regime of exchange rates and international payments. They manage poverty in third world countries by providing short-term loans, and their sister organization, the World Bank, provides longer-term loans for developmental projects. They are lenders of last resort that work together. There are 180 members of the IMF, but the US has 17% of the voting power, significantly more than any other country in there, with the next greatest share being about 6%. They have 16% in the World Bank, with making it the only country with enough power to veto any World Bank decision. On the surface, this all sounds pretty great. Who wouldn't want to help poor countries after all? A full expose of the IMF and World Bank global financial machine is a bit beyond the scope of this video. But let's just say that American imperialism and Western colonialism are alive and well in the modern day. Many of the developing countries that borrowed from these institutions back in the day were run by authoritarian regimes that blatantly pocketed a lot of the money from the loans. which were given anyway, as there seemed no other way to deliver nation-level aid to those countries. But of course, when said dictators retire in comfort, their nations are still stuck with the bill, and importantly, the terms that came along with those loans. Policies like fiscal austerity, high interest rates, trade liberalization, privatization, and open capital markets have been counterproductive for some target economies, especially in the poorest countries that have the weakest domestic means of production. On paper, many of these interventions make sense in a general sort of way. You can take an extended look on, free market capitalism, economics, and protectionism in my video in the description. But that kind of ignores the cookie-cutter approach that the IMF has taken and the exploitation of markets by multinational corporations and Western investors that typically follows the aid from the IMF. These countries then become export-oriented markets that end up selling off all of their natural resources, which in a globalized market results in various countries competing with each other to offer the best prices internationally. This would ultimately cause a decline in the prices of said goods, one good example being the Senegalese ground nut market. Short story, a fall in the prices of a poor nation's staple export can result in a worse economic hardship and often the need for further loans, perpetuating a cycle of dependence on Western money and the emergence of a debt trap. Yes, this is a heavily abbreviated version of the problem, but we don't have all day. The IMF and the World Bank routinely keep third world countries and their economies dependent on first world loans, deepening Western hegemony via debt colonialism. If you're going to point to evil on a grand scale, look no further. And these institutions, not people, institutions, they are against crypto. And screw them. So there, I can play that game too. Not that I enjoy doing so, because frankly, the controversy surrounding these institutions is actually much more complicated than I'm letting on here, and I recognize that. I'll put some resource in the description, but while we're playing this game, I figure I may as well throw my own lot in there. By the way, if you're wondering why I haven't yet fulfilled my promise to point out systemic distortions due to the presence of an individual actor, don't worry, we'll get there.
This is a really important point to stress. Cryptocurrency does nothing to address 99% of the problems with the banking industry, because those problems are patterns of human behavior, their incentives, their social structures, their modalities. The problem is what people are doing to others, not that the building they're doing it in has the word bank on the outside.
So this is another point that, if you accept the way that it's framed, sounds really good. But are the only problems with the banking industry's social structures and modalities 99% of them? And does rebuilding a financial system upon a different framework not provide an opportunity to adjust incentive structures and use different modalities? I can concede that Bitcoin and crypto aren't going to implicitly solve the problems with society at large, but I'm not sold on the idea that decentralized finance won't make a difference to 99% of banking's problems. Let's take an example that's explicitly stated as a goal of cryptocurrency: banking the unbanked. At the moment, about 6% of the United States is unbanked, and about 16% are classified as underbanked. Banks often require specific forms of identification and various other account requirements like minimum balances and monthly service fees for opening and maintaining accounts that contribute to the increased cost of being poor. Oftentimes it's minorities that are disproportionately affected by this cost. If you can't afford a bank account and thus can't get direct deposit, where do you cash your checks? Probably a place like Walmart that charges extra for that service. If you need to use credit for an emergency expense and can't get approved for a short-term personal loan or a decent credit card or line of credit from a bank because you don't have a credit card history, have a poor credit card history, or just don't have a bank, well, these are the types of people that end up having to use payday loans. That debt cycle is basically a micro-scale version of the IMF's debt trap. All it takes for a poor person to get stuck in that cycle is a single bad turn and a moment of desperation. They may even know that it's a bad idea, but need to resort to such things in order to make it to the next payday. Hence, payday loans. And these loans have ridiculous interest rates, which are normally limited, but payday loans get around this by calling them renewal fees instead of interest accrual. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a way around that? Peer-to-peer blockchain lending is a way around that. And crypto wallets, as Dan pointed out earlier in the video, are essentially a way around bank accounts, given the proper infrastructure. This is not nothing. With the proper infrastructure, they can also be a way around ATM fees. Now, to be clear, I qualified that with the proper infrastructure because that is currently not the case yet anywhere except El Salvador, where their Chivo wallet actually bypasses ATM fees and enables you to bypass the banking system while also having crypto ATMs if you want to use fiat. Otherwise, the money essentially has to go through banks anyway if you want to convert to fiat. This is not even to mention the informal tax on poverty in the form of overdraft fees, which don't exist in crypto. Remember that many banks deliberately reorder your transactions for a given day to maximize how much they get in overdraft fee. Also, it costs a shocking amount to have to pay your bills in money orders every month because you can't afford to keep a bank account open. With regard to Bitcoin and other crypto assets, with fixed monetary policies, the protection from inflation is also kind of a big deal, as the loss of purchasing power from inflation also tends to hit poor people, once again disproportionately minorities, harder than wealthier people because of the way inflation is typically distributed. Food, transportation, housing, and healthcare are often affected the most by inflation, something that's not well captured by a lot of traditional metrics. There's total market inflation as measured by things like CPI or core inflation, and then there's personal inflation rate, which is weighted by how much you actually use goods and services, which is much more relevant to you on a daily basis. As many are fond of saying, Bitcoin at its heart is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's a don't-get-poor-slowly scheme. Protecting your purchasing power from inflation is kind of a big deal, and arguably one of the basic reasons that you need to invest in assets that appreciate in value over time, even if you have no interest in getting rich. This feature of Bitcoin and various other crypto assets is particularly important in less stable countries whose governments are actively debasing the currency in order to, fund debt, basically. This, as we'll cover a bit more later, is both the reason that the crypto narrative has moved away from medium of exchange and the reason it's gone more towards store of value, as deflation is good for saving and bad for economy scale currencies. And this is just the start. There's more reasons that crypto assets are useful in ways that the banking system isn't, as crypto Twitter is fond of reminding Peter Schiff basically every day. But, you might ask, what about the more complex financial instruments like collateralized debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities? Well, wouldn't you know it, those already exist in crypto. Now, one could argue that the transparent nature of blockchain-based financial applications could limit the downside of using these complex derivatives, that the risk profile of the average DeFi lending app is vastly different from that seen in the financial crisis, and that DeFi apps have little chance of actually becoming insolvent because of programmatic liquidation settings. But the fact remains that they are still there. These things still exist in crypto. Not only that, but get this. The company that reintroduced CDOs and credit default swaps into the world of crypto was unironically called Opium Finance and funded in a private sale, among other sources, by ex-Goldman Sachs executive Mike Novogratz, a concrete example of an old guard financier's influence being used to drag Web3 back into dark waters. Told you I wouldn't forget. In this case, by the way, Novogratz was actually a relatively early investor, getting in around 2013 when Bitcoin was around $100, during a period when he was ostensibly retired from finance and from working with Goldman Sachs, one of the banks behind the great financial crisis. But even he approached crypto in a purely speculative way, as recently as 2017, calling Bitcoin a bubble, being purely to enrich himself in his capacity as a smoke vendor before everything went crashing through the floor. He fits better into the folding ideas narrative than any example actually given in the original video. But 5 years after his bubble statements, time in the markets have done so far nothing but prove Novogratz wrong about his assessment of Bitcoin and made him a billionaire again. He may have gotten in thinking he could trade a massive amount of smoke, but he's accidentally stumbled onto the hardest asset he ever touched. He sings a very different tune now, citing the maturity of the ecosystem, although his support is something the crypto community only begrudgingly accepts. We are very aware of his past and connections, and the irony of his role in the ecosystem is not lost on us. The fact remains that Goldman only recognized Bitcoin and crypto as a legitimate investable asset class as recently as last year, 2021, after over a decade of dismissing and then deriding it to the media. Mike is an exception and by no means a smoking gun for bankers' early interest in the crypto market more broadly. Now, I will not sit here and tell you that blockchain has solved the problem of risky, complex financial instruments and their potential for being used to exploit the poor and minorities simply by existing. This claim is demonstrably false. I just demonstrated it. There is no conceivable mechanism to both benefit from the high level of adoption implied by the entry of big financial players into the market while simultaneously barring them from participating in, profiting from, and ultimately influencing the system for their own gain. At some point, they're going to get involved. What is a project to do then? Just close up shop and rug pull the whole ecosystem the moment that dirty VC money rears its ugly head to preserve ideological purity? Global adoption will result in the involvement of some unsavory players, just as a matter of course. Global means everyone. However, to say that 99% of banking's problems are not solved by cryptocurrency simply because 100% of those problems are not, seems like a bit of a stretch. And putting that responsibility on Bitcoin specifically makes no sense. We'll revisit these ideas when we talk about Ethereum.
In addition to not fixing problems, Bitcoin also came with a pretty substantial drawback. The innovation of Bitcoin over previous attempts at digital currency was to employ a distributed append-only ledger, a kind of database where new entries can only be added to the end, and then to have several different nodes called validators compete over who gets to validate the next update. These are, respectively, the blockchain and proof-of-work verification, specifically to incur heavy diminishing returns as a protection against an attack on the network where someone just builds a bigger computer and takes over. Critics pointed out that this created new problems. Adversarial validation would deliberately incur escalating processing costs, which would in turn generate perverse structural incentives that would quickly reward capital holders and lock out any individual that wasn't already obscenely wealthy, because while the escalating proof-of-work scheme incurs heavy diminishing returns are still returns. So more would always go to those with the resources to build the bigger rig. No matter what Bitcoin future was envisioned, in the here and now, computer hardware can be bought with dollars. Rather than dismantling corrupt power structures, this would just become a new tool for existing wealth. Don't worry, we're not forgetting the power requirements. These rigs draw an industrial amount of power, and because of the winner-takes-all nature of the competition, huge amounts of redundant work are being done and discarded. Estimates for this power consumption are hard to verify. The data is very complex, spread across hundreds of operators around the globe who move frequently in search of cheap electricity, and it's all pretty heavily politicized. But even conservative estimates from within the crypto mining industry puts the sum energy cost of Bitcoin processing on par with the power consumption of a small industrialized nation.
Now, this is actually what my next few videos were going to be about, but when I saw that he made a number of my points for me and just kind of teed me up pretty nicely to review some of what I already said in the past, I knew this had to be my next video. So his first criticism of Bitcoin's proof of work is a legitimate one, though as we'll see, it's not necessarily an insurmountable one by any means. Rising hardware requirements associated with a larger, more active proof of work network result in a form of centralization simply because at this point, you would have to be able to basically run an industrial scale mining operation to be profitable, or otherwise spend a significant amount of money on cloud mining services, which would then lead to them running an industrial scale mining operation. We'll loop back around to this point before we move on from energy consumption. Next, we go over the escalating power requirements of proof-of-work mining. This one's a little bit more complex, and to his credit, Dan lays out a better argument than you hear from most sources. He throws out a few potential sources to ballpark exactly how much power that ends up being, but we're told that the exact number is unimportant because different numbers can be reached using different sources and methodologies. He then provides a direct comparison of energy consumption between Visa and Bitcoin, saying that the massive TPS discrepancy between layer 1 Bitcoin and Visa means that Bitcoin uses a lot more energy per transaction. I actually kind of like this framing because it seems to get at efficiency instead of total energy consumption, which is more what I think we should be looking at. But he doesn't take this quite far enough. He simply makes this comparison, allows for a bit of the waste in the centralized banking system, and concludes that even with the waste in the centralized system is still more energy efficient. and says that mining actually offsets the move from fossil fuels to renewables instead of catalyzes it. From first principles, this whole line of thought seems a little odd, given that at its core, power efficiency is the central concern of Bitcoin mining. As a miner, efficiency is the thing that determines your margins and therefore your profitability. How is it that mining operations started off with focus entirely on efficiency and somehow still ended up with a transaction system that is more inefficient and wasteful than any other we've ever seen? Well, things aren't exactly what they seem on the surface. First of all, I'd point out that there's actually three things to consider here. First, how energy efficient the system is. Note that I said the system and not just the payment arm. We'll come back to that heavily in a second. The energy mix involved and how much we value what that system does. Let's start with that last one first, as I feel that it'll provide a bit more context to the discussion overall. How much we value what a system like Bitcoin does should determine how much energy we feel willing to spend on it. So to start with, let's take a look at a few comparisons of the network's energy consumption as a proxy for how its value compares to some other things that we use. Let's throw out a few actual numbers for the Bitcoin network's energy consumption. One is 91 terawatt hours per year. That comes from a widely cited New York Times article that itself references another study. And 121 terawatt hours per year. That comes from a 2021 Cambridge University study that was cited by the BBC. The popular comparison here is Bitcoin versus small countries. For instance, Argentina at 121 terawatt hours, near the higher end of that, the Netherlands at 108.8 terawatt hours, and the United Arab Emirates at 113.2 terawatt hours. Note that these countries are very small and don't actually use that much energy to begin with. The common Bitcoiner argument here is that, the Bitcoin network uses less energy than Christmas lights use around the world every single year. Now, actually, this claim is probably false. If you actually look at the original Center for Global Development blog post that people point to, or the original EIA study that it cites, you'll see that the numbers it cites for countries other than the United States are actually their total energy consumption. And this was kind of taken out and recontextualized as, this is their Christmas light energy consumption, which is actually false. So people like Mike Novogratz and a lot of crypto Twitter have been misled by a misrepresentation of this blog post. But if we keep looking at that same report, which once again only looks at the United States of America, we see that step/porch/path lights, along with retail display lights, make up another 54 terawatt hours per year. Together with decorative lights like Christmas lights, brings us up to 60 terawatt hours per year in the United States alone. All of those decorative lights, about 6.6 terawatt hours in the US alone, and arguably most, if not all, of the other types of lights here, are either not essential or only of bonus aesthetic value. But we don't get too worked up about that. If we go to other developed nations and add these same things up, we would undoubtedly leave the Bitcoin network in the dust. Importantly, the energy mix used to power these applications is grid dependent and in many countries is well below 50% renewable. If we want another example, gold mining uses almost 250 terawatt hours per year globally, and 80% of its circulating supply is used for jewelry, which is clearly non-essential. A more recent CoinShares.com report estimates that Bitcoin's total energy consumption is about 0.08% of total global energy consumption, a rounding error. Not only that, it uses less energy than what the world uses on just dryers, like clothes dryers, like what you dry your clothes in. So then the question of value becomes, do we value a network like the Bitcoin network or another proof of work network more than we value lighting appliances and shiny trinkets, which we've already allocated a massive amount of energy to? Keep this in mind as we go in more detail on use cases, their potential positive environmental impacts, and also when we go on to talk about proof of stake. And keep in mind that Bitcoin is not the only option available. Remember, I'm not a maximalist, and I see Bitcoin as an early technology that would need a lot of upgrades before it's ready for prime time. We can do better in terms of layer 1 blockchains for sure, but even in the realm of Bitcoin itself, we can do better with structural layer 1 upgrades like SegWit, but also with layer 2 solutions like Lightning and Liquid. We'll come back to these later. But for now, let's return to that first consideration. How energy efficient is the system? And for this, we come back to our Visa example. The problem here is that this is by no means an apples-to-apples comparison. Visa does not facilitate these transactions in isolation. Let's take a look at the anatomy of a credit card transaction to start with. First of all, there's the front-end processor that does the immediate work of scanning your credit card's information to the merchant's bank, the acquiring bank. They also forward this information to the credit card association, in this case Visa, who then figures out who issued your credit card, the issuing bank. Visa then sends your info to whichever payment processor the issuing bank uses to validate your information and confirm your funds or credit. Once that's done, all of this flows back from the issuing bank to the payment processor, to Visa, to the front-end processor, to the merchant, and finally to the acquiring bank to make this one transaction occur. Bitcoin is the entire payment system and the currency used in that payment system. So you can see why this comparison doesn't really make a lot of sense. Furthermore, we should make the distinction between Visa's energy consumption per transaction and Bitcoin's energy consumption per block. The energy used to simply do a transaction on the Bitcoin network is relatively small, and the lion's share of that energy consumption comes from what is spent on mining a new Bitcoin per block. So this seems superficial, but it is particularly important for a few reasons. One, because there is actually an asymptote to the race mechanics set up by the proof of work algorithm. The last new Bitcoin will be mined around the year 2140. And after that, only block fees will continue to incentivize miners. The escalation will no longer be profitable, causing the industry to downsize, causing a reduction in mining difficulty, which then would increase the profitability, and so on and so forth, until the system reaches a certain equilibrium. Where is that equilibrium going to be? When will this process start? Is not entirely clear. In a way, the process of that has actually kind of already started, as mentioned in the Folding Ideas video, but that race mechanic is asymptotic. It doesn't just go off into infinity forever. And likely, this equilibrium should be reached well before 2140. Also, as we've seen with the introduction of SegWit and then Taproot, the metric of transactions per block is one that can and likely will be improved going forward. On top of this, you also have to consider the global knock-on effects of mining and the progress of ASIC mining efficiency going forward to get a more comprehensive picture of how proof of work affects energy consumption. Notice I just said proof of work here instead of simply Bitcoin, and we'll see why shortly. So first of all, we also haven't yet accounted for energy mix just yet, and the fact that energy consumption is not equivalent to carbon emissions. From an environmental standpoint, we care about carbon emissions a lot more than we care about just total energy consumption. Now, accurate estimates of carbon emissions here are pretty difficult. A 2019 report estimated about 79% of Bitcoin's energy consumption was from renewable energy sources. A 2020 CCAF report estimated that this was closer to 40%. A 2021 Bitcoin Mining Council reported 57% of Bitcoin's mining consumption was from renewable sources. I tend to kind of believe that last one a little bit more, given that it was from a survey of actual Bitcoin miners, but the point is that it's a very wide distribution. A more recent CoinShares.com report estimated energy distribution thusly: 35% coal, 24% gas, 21% hydro, 11% nuclear, wind at 4%, and the rest being largely renewables like geothermal. The important point here is actually that these numbers, whichever one ends up being closest to the truth, are actually just snapshots of the truth. The more important point to make here are in trends and opportunities. So let's talk opportunities. First, we waste massive amounts of renewable energy every single year. Like literally 30% of all renewable energy globally is wasted. Some have said that there is no excess renewable energy because we need more of it than we use, but this is blatantly not true. And the most obvious example of this is hydro. In certain parts of China, production of hydroelectric power far outpaces demand, and battery technology is entirely insufficient to simply store and transport that energy to urban centers for later use. This stranded energy that otherwise would be simply wasted is a large part of why those parts of China became large hubs for Bitcoin mining. The utilization of stranded renewable energy to support an entire banking system is a large opportunity that traditional banking simply can't capitalize on. On top of that, the economic reality remains that energy companies, especially renewable energy companies, require a baseload of consumers in order to scale. By bolstering this baseload, the mining industry essentially functions as a direct subsidy to the renewable energy companies, allowing them to achieve greater economies of scale faster and acting as a catalyst to transitioning the grid towards renewable energy. And of course, you knew I was going to mention it. Flared natural gas is another area of opportunity for proof-of-work mining that is basically a free lunch when it comes to carbon emissions, or at least as close as to a free lunch as we're ever really going to get in these things. Modern oil extraction, at least especially in the beginning of it, releases a massive load of methane that is simply vented, which is mostly illegal at this point, or more commonly in the United States, flared to the atmosphere, and that energy never reaches the grid. It just becomes a direct carbon, like a greenhouse gas. You know when you see those chimney stacks with massive flames just shooting out of them? That's flaring. Now, carbon capture is the long-term goal, but it's going to take some time to actually build out the infrastructure to do that at scale. We will come back to that shortly. Some calculations have suggested that there's actually enough flared natural gas, stuff that would otherwise just be wasted energy, flared and released directly into the environment, in the US and Canada alone to power the entire Bitcoin network as of 2021. At the very least, the entire non-renewable part of proof-of-work's energy mix can be transitioned over to flared natural gas as quickly as the infrastructure can be built. Yes, this still produces emissions, as using this resource would require a controlled combustion process, but this would still mitigate greenhouse gas emission from initial oil extraction by 24x. Immediately, it cuts it down to a 24th of what it was before. You might be tempted to think, hey, doesn't this act as basically like a subsidy to the fossil fuel companies then? Wouldn't that incentivize them to further invest in oil infrastructure and extraction, perhaps in ways that they might not have done otherwise? Well, that leads us into trends. Where are we going from an energy consumption standpoint, and how does proof of work factor into that? At this point, the trend is very much towards greener energy, not only in the world at large, but in crypto specifically. In the world of proof of stake crypto especially, newer blockchains are being built largely with sustainability in mind, with chains like Algorand and Cardano targeting carbon neutrality on their L1s and building their ecosystems to have positive environmental impacts. Ripple and XRP are actually committed to having full carbon neutrality by the year 2030. Veritree is actually planting a Cardano forest with their funds being exchanged for NFTs on the Cardano blockchain. Having reached their funding for 1 million trees, they plan on starting the planting process over the next 6 months in Madagascar. But even in proof of work, we now have things like the Crypto Climate Accord, formed by organizations of miners and other crypto companies, committed to switching entirely to renewable energy by 2025 and bringing the industry entirely to net zero by 2040. Now, to be fair, the mining operations that have joined that particular accord at this point are relatively small. The trend toward green energy on a larger scale is driven less by formal agreements and more by the street-level realities of mining. The standard argument here is that miners will buy the cheapest possible energy source. And with renewables like wind and solar becoming progressively cheaper, and as they reach parity and then become less expensive than fossil fuels, miners will subsidize the growth of the renewable energy sector. Now, that's a pretty low resolution way of making that argument. And at that scale, the criticisms of things like low uptime of these types of energy sources like solar and wind make them undesirable for mining. These are immediately relevant. We have to go a bit deeper to build a more convincing picture of how proof of work's carbon footprint might evolve. The first thing we should talk about is life cycle mining. This is pretty much the idea that we've reached a point where it makes sense to tailor energy mix to the age of the mining machines in question. You need higher uptime for your newer mining rigs, the ones with higher specs that can get you better hash rates, and oftentimes with better energy efficiency as well. So these newer machines tend to get hooked up to the grid and then take on the energy mix associated with whatever grid in the country that they happen to be in. But 30% of the hash rate at this point is actually held up by Bitmain S9s, a 5-year-old ASIC type that at this point is just not economical to run 24/7 with grid power. For these, energy cost is the defining consideration, given that they don't make as much money anyway, so intermittent downtime doesn't have the same opportunity cost. The next thing to consider that kind of goes along with the first really, is that it now makes sense for miners to interrupt their energy draw from the grid in favor of renewables when we have excess renewable energy that would otherwise be wasted, thus reducing the energy cost basis overall. This, once again, functions as a direct subsidy to renewable energy, as it allows these companies to monetize their product even at times when the grid has no real use for it. Renewable energy companies are moving towards miners as uncorrelated buyers, and even nuclear is starting to get in on that action. Proof-of-work mining is also able to return some of its energy consumption back to the grid for useful applications. Siberia's Hot Mine project comes to mind here. They've pioneered the use of so-called miner heaters to heat a cottage town of about 12 private residences free of charge. More recently, North Vancouver has started leveraging this particular technology, the heat from proof-of-work mining, to become the first city entirely heated this way.
So I actually think I'm underselling the importance of electrifying our energy, and it's really something that I only recently discovered, that actually a lot of our energy consumption is not able to directly benefit from the lowering price of renewables. And so let me go ahead and give you somebody a good bit more qualified than me to speak on the subject before we get back to your regularly scheduled programming.
About the supply side of energy, they think, oh, we'll build more solar, we'll put more windmills up, and then we'll get there. But at the same time, we have to remember that only 20% of energy demand is currently electrified. So there's this whole, piece of energy demand, 80%, that is not currently able to use solar, not able to use wind power. So what we've really got to focus on now is how do we transition that 80%? So we're talking about transport, we're talking about heat, we're talking about industrial processes.
Next, we can take a look at the ASIC development cycle. And what we see here is that it's slowing down, largely because we've reached the physical limits of our transistor designs. Intel, last month in February 2022, released a new mining rig that was 15% more energy efficient, but only 15% more efficient. So as the edge provided by newer ASIC miners gets thinner and thinner, ASIC generations last longer and longer. A well-maintained miner these days can last 3 to 5 years, allowing mining operations to put more and more of their machines on renewables, cutting the rate at which the industry produces e-waste. If we take these concepts and look more closely at how they would interact with the grid, we can see further benefits. As we've been building up, proof-of-work mining can serve as a source of interruptible and controllable load. Miners can participate in so-called demand response programs that give them rebates in exchange for agreeing to limit, even cut off their power at times when the grid is stressed and prices are high. Also, grids can modulate the energy use of mining operations to make up for shortfalls in energy supply in seconds, thus limiting the need for fossil fuels and peaker plants. Take a look at the description for a study laying out how this could actually incentivize the installment of more renewable energy plants. Now, coming back to the thing about flared natural gas before we move on to my last point regarding proof of work, the objection remains, wouldn't this set up the wrong incentives, rewarding the continued use of fossil fuels? Well, the reality of the world we live in, unfortunately, is that we are wildly dependent on fossil fuels. Even at the breakneck pace of building out green infrastructure, it would likely take at least until 2035 to get the US grid to 90% renewables. This is assuming a very aggressive change in policy, which could be possible as the price of renewable energy goes down, but to be honest, I'm a little pessimistic that we actually reach that level so quickly. The fact remains, that's still over a decade. Utilizing energy from natural gas flaring in the meantime creates jobs and, as I said, reduces carbon emissions from that initial oil extraction process 24x. 1/24th of what it is right now. Importantly, this is not really something we can do with regulation in the meantime, as if we simply regulate away the flaring of natural gas and require carbon capture immediately, that would increase the price of domestic energy production, and that demand would just go overseas for said gas. And then we'd be importing from countries that have no qualms about flaring natural gas, or even venting natural gas. What we can do in the meantime is regulate the practice over time as we build out our renewable energy infrastructure and scale up carbon capture infrastructure and technology to replace flaring long term. But that will take quite a while. And during that time, we have to choose how we're going to mitigate our ongoing emissions. Getting proof of work miners in on the action just seems like a no-brainer at this point until we can replace it with carbon capture long term. And yes, the implicit assumption here is that once renewables outprice fossil fuels, the incentive problem will take care of itself anyway. Taking a look here at the levelized cost of energy from 2009 to 2019, you can see why I'm actually pretty optimistic that this should be possible in the coming decades. It's also worth noting that the focus on renewables in the world of mining going forward is driving the build-out of large renewable energy projects. El Salvador's volcano-powered renewable mining setup that's underway right now is a high-profile example of this. They want to power an entire city with it, although these are early days and the plans are vague enough that I have to see some more progress before I believe all the promises. Proof of work mining is a technology that somehow got even a backwards snake like Ted Cruz interested in energy efficiency and the transition to renewable power sources. Though the extent of that is very much to be seen, as we know, politicians, words and actions tend to have large gaps in them. One last point that we haven't mentioned at all until now is the carbon emissions offset effect that blockchain technologies can have as a result of their incorporation into other industries. Put a pin in that, and we'll give some very specific examples when we reach the shipping part. Coming back to the video, it's a minor point, but...
And that's just Visa. That's one major institution.
Let's not forget that Visa is the single largest payments network in the world by a large margin, beating out MasterCard by 100 million users by the end of 2021. The numbers are a bit less skewed than this for every other payment network in existence, but as we pointed out, this is not even close to an apples-to-apples comparison.
So, yes, globally, the entirety of the banking industry consumes a lot of power, and a non-trivial portion of that is waste that could be better allocated. But it's also the global banking industry for 7 billion people, and not the hobby horse of a few 100,000 gambling addicts.
I'm not going to touch on the gambling addicts part just yet, but keep that in mind. We'll come back to that at the end, because I was wondering, how on earth did he miss some of these obvious things? We'll come back to it. He then reiterates his point on energy before moving on to Ethereum. But before we follow him there, let's take a moment to talk about what I briefly alluded to earlier about the difference between proof of work and Bitcoin. Maximalists, like, say, Jack Dorsey, for instance, like to point out that it is, it was mined from nothing, it's truly decentralized, and at least theoretically, nothing in the currently highly VC-saturated space could possibly match Bitcoin in that regard. It's hard to say in the age of, Taproot and the advent of more expressive smart contracts based on Bitcoin, that this actually solves the bigger issues with banking to a greater capacity than other crypto networks can. With Taproot, and especially with things like Stacks Network, they use a so-called proof of reserve to bring extra functionality to a Bitcoin network base. There's nothing stopping the introduction of things like credit default swaps and CDOs from incorporating the Bitcoin brand and utilizing the Bitcoin network for their own ends. I don't want to get too bogged down on that again, but where I'm going instead here is just other proof-of-work solutions and the trade-offs that they make instead. And there's always trade-offs. We'll mention 3 here: Cadena, Ergo, and Bitcoin SV. Note that this isn't meant to promote these 3 coins in particular, just to demonstrate some concepts. Let's start with Bitcoin SV, as it's the closest to what we've already talked about. It actually still uses the original Nakamoto consensus protocol, but it simply does away with the block size limit entirely, allowing for drastic increases in throughput. To anyone with a more Bitcoin Core purist mindset, this is by far the least appealing solution of the group, despite their claim that they are, most close to Satoshi's original vision as laid out by the white paper. The result of this solution is a highly scalable chain that can achieve apparently like 50,000 TPS, allowing it to surpass even Visa, drastically increased energy efficiency, making it the most energy efficient proof of work chain in existence. Transaction fees well below payment networks like Visa, while still being more than just a payment solution that Visa offers. And it's already so centralized, there's really no point in even comparing it to Bitcoin Core. If you look at Bitcoin SV's hashing concentration, Tal, a single mining pool, at one point controlled over 80% of total hash power. How could this happen? Well, an unbounded block size is going to mean that the size of the total blockchain is going to get very unwieldy very fast. Only a few industrial level players will be able to invest in the hardware required to store the entire blockchain and spin up a full node. Bitcoin SV had a very troubling double spend attack in 2021 at a time when it only had about 0.5% of the Bitcoin Core total hashing power. Given how small it was, the viability of this attack makes sense. But the fact that at this phase it's already so centralized kind of defeats the purpose of a distributed ledger to begin with. Bitcoin SV is essentially just doomed to become another Visa in terms of payments, although, albeit a better system that includes a full financial ecosystem. This leads us to our next player, Kadena. Kadena is a very young chain that still uses proof of work, but instead of a single blockchain, it proposes to braid multiple Bitcoin-like blockchains together, allowing for the parallelization of throughput with what they call a chain web that looks something like this. These aren't simply parallel chains, as that would end up with each chain having its own currency, and it would dramatically decrease the hash power required to attack each chain. However, instead of having each chain point only to the hash of the previous block, like in Bitcoin, Kadena's chain web has each hash point to 3 other hashes per block, the utility of which is understood through the graph theory idea of degree and diameter. Degree refers to how many other nodes a single node points to, or how many edges it has. And diameter refers to how many hops it takes from node to node that it would take to get to a node on the other side of the network. Kadena has currently transitioned from a 10-node network to a 20-node network that has degree 3 and diameter 3. We'll cover all of this and the graph theory aspect more in depth in a separate video dedicated to that in the near future, but we won't go too far into the weeds in this video. Given that each chain has a 30-second block time, with 20 chains in parallel, you get about a 1.5-second network block time. With its current 20 chains, the layer 1 is capable of around 600 TPS with a 90-second finality time, and its layer 2 scaling solution, Kuro, scaling this up apparently to like 480,000 TPS with near instant finality. Note that the layer 1 can continue scaling by adding more chains to the braided web. And they do all this with nearly 0 transaction fees while also using about only 1 kilowatt hour per 100,000 transactions. This largely diminishes the relevance of the energy mix discussion and even the sustainability argument by using simply way less energy than Bitcoin. Now, the trade-offs here include some deeply concerning tokenomics and minor incentivization schemes, which we'll talk about in another video because there's actually a good bit to say on that. Like I said, there's always trade-offs. It's just a matter of what you find acceptable to achieve the goal that you're going for. What you should be noticing at this point is that while Bitcoin and Nakamoto consensus provided a good framework to work from, the march of technological advancement did not stop in 2009 with the Bitcoin Core Genesis block. Let's go over one last example to further drive that point home. Let's look at Ergo. Ergo, like BSV, Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, has no block size limits and is able to modulate its block size to match demand. Like Bitcoin, it was mined into existence from zero and has no VC funding. just like Bitcoin. Ergo has like a 90 to 120 second block time, but TPS is a little harder to nail down because it purports to bundle hundreds of transactions into one, making direct comparisons to account-based systems like Visa difficult. According to founder Alex Chepernoy, I'm probably butchering that, miners will eventually be able to set any number they want for TPS. The Ergo platform uses a proof-of-work protocol called Autolycos, or Autolycos. Once again, probably butchering that, but now it's Autolycos 2.0. That is a proof-of-work protocol that is what's called memory hard, which is meant to limit the advantage of ASIC miners over GPU miners, which in theory tamps down the race mechanics towards higher energy consumption and helps to maintain an egalitarian mining environment. The really interesting part here is not its basic layer 1 implementation as it stands right now, but its capacity for improvement and extension while also preserving its basic economic policies. Future scaling plans include NepoPow proofs, UTXO set snapshots, sharding, Hydra, Bitcoin NG-style macro blocks, compatibility with the Lightning networks, Rainbow Network, etc., other types of networks with that are present on other chains, stateless clients, full nodes on Raspberry Pis, ultra-efficient SPV clients, etc. There's a lot more to it. So not all proof of work needs to be a technological monolith, and the layer 2 scaling solutions and even layer 1 adjustments can play a really big role in how a certain chain develops and how it functions over time. And finally, we move on to Ethereum.
Vitalik Buterin, a crypto enthusiast and butthurt warlock main, set out to fix what he saw as the failings and inflexibilities of Bitcoin. Rather than becoming the new digital currency, a thing that people actually use to buy stuff, Bitcoin had become an unwieldy speculative financial instrument, too slow and expensive to use for anything other than stunt purchases of expensive cars. It was infested with money laundering and mired in bad press. After the FBI shut down Silk Road, you couldn't even buy drugs with it anymore.
So right off the bat there's a few things that need to be clarified. A road from obscure techno-utopian idea in the mind of Satoshi Nakamoto to widely accepted currency usable for everyday payments is, to put it lightly, an exceedingly long one. It is a road filled with potholes and booby traps. Used to be you could buy a Tesla in Bitcoin. Now you can't. And at some point in the future, you probably will be able to again. Used to be you couldn't pay your taxes with it. Now, in some parts of Switzerland and all of El Salvador, you can. Used to be there were no countries it was legal tender in. Now, it's legal tender in El Salvador, and in the near future may well be in Tonga as well. 13 years after its inception, one tiny Latin American country has adopted it as a hedge against the Fed's inflationary economic policies during a time of crisis. And that country is still getting flack from the IMF, urging it strongly to rescind its coin's legal tender status. More recently, Texas and Arizona have introduced bills, likely to fail admittedly, that would give Bitcoin legal tender status in those states. Even with all that, it's surprising we've gotten this far this quickly, given that we've only recently seen large banks get around to accepting Bitcoin as a legitimate asset. Pointing out that around 2012 that Bitcoin hadn't become a widely accepted currency within 3 years is dumb. Even if you think that's what its ultimate goal should be, and again, I'm not necessarily convinced of that personally, the implied timeline of doing that in a few years is insane, especially in a world where the United States dollar is the global reserve currency backed by the largest army in human history. That's like expecting Wish, the dollar store equivalent of Amazon, to entirely replace Amazon's market share within a few years. Although, admittedly, this is a bad example because Wish has little hope of ever getting anywhere. Get at me, Wish investors. Your company is nonsense. It will always be nonsense. You're bad investors, and you should feel bad. The second point I want to address there is the money laundering angle. This was a really popular part of the mainstream narrative at the time, as I covered in my Crypto Winters and Bear Markets video, which you can see in the top right. To this day, it remains a largely unconvincing way of thinking. As Dan is about to stress in the next segment or two, most blockchains are inherently not very private, and not an ideal medium for illicit activity, at least partly because it's very hard to cash out large illegitimate holdings. This is something we actually saw after a recent hack, when the hacker actually returned part of the money because they couldn't actually get away with cashing it all out. More privacy chains like Monero that are almost exclusively geared toward illicit activity, and this line of thought is much more relevant to them. They, however, will never reach mainstream adoption for precisely this reason, along with the infeasibility of KYC on these chains making accurate taxation essentially impossible. More mainstream coins like Bitcoin, for example, are really no more suited to money laundering than the dollar. If anything, the dollar is superior for money laundering. According to multiple sources, the proportional volume of money laundering done through the traditional banking system with fiat far outpaces that done with Bitcoin. When it comes to money laundering, the dollar remains the undisputed king. Now, recent upgrades like Taproot definitely allow for an augmented level of privacy with Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is by no means a privacy chain because of that. Can you use Bitcoin to help launder money? Sure. Does simply using Bitcoin for a transaction hide you from authorities? Absolutely not. Especially if you use a centralized exchange, or if you store your keys on a cloud server like an idiot, or, dox yourself like an idiot. There's a lot of ways to screw that up. Next, he gives a broad overview of what Ethereum's founders hope to accomplish in making Ethereum, and the potential significance of including smart contracts in the blockchain platform. After this, he goes on to critique Camilo Rousseau's The Infinite Machine, which he then lambasts as an uncritical look at the origin story of Ethereum, which may well be true. I don't know because I haven't read it. Why not? Because I really don't care what Camilo Rousseau thinks about anything and am in no way committed to defending her claims.
The entire crypto space during the entire time that Rousseau's book covers was absolutely awash with astroturfing schemes where two guys would go to some small community in Laos or Angola, take a bunch of pictures of people at a crypto investing seminar, generate some headlines for their coin or fund, and then peace out. For years, dudes were going around asking vendors if they could slap a Bitcoin sticker onto the back of the cash register because the optics of making it look like a place takes Bitcoin was cheaper and easier than actually using Bitcoin as a currency. We have an entire decade of credulous articles about how Venezuela and Chile are on the verge of switching entirely to crypto, based entirely on the claim of two trust fund dudes from San Bernardino.
So first of all, this is an absolutely important thing to note about the early crypto space. Heck, it's an important thing to note about the current modern crypto space, which is still pretty darn early. It's way less regulated than the traditional securities market. There's a lot of scams out there, and there's a lot of ways that people can take your money and not really face any concrete legal consequences. Going by simply number of projects, the vast majority of the ones that you'll see on exchanges, large exchanges like KuCoin or Bitfinex, have no value, will never have value, and may even be outright scams. There are fake gurus in the crypto space abound. This was true back then, and it is true now. There was a lot of fake news going around then and now, and a lot of what we in the space call hopium for bag holders to ravenously smoke down when they need extra motivation to ape their life savings into a particular coin. All of this is true. Crypto was, and still is, the Wild West of the finance world. It is scary and volatile and sparsely regulated. But so was the early stock market. So was the real estate market as recently as 2008 and 2009. So was the world of modern sports betting, media marketing, and courses claiming to teach you about the ways to consistently make gains while day trading stocks or Forex or anything else. If you watch Spencer Cornelia's channel, you know that basically any space where you can conceivably make any money, there's scammers waiting to take your money if you give them but a moment of your time, an ounce of your faith, and just a few easy payments of $29.99. Crypto is no exception. But if you've been paying attention to the macro space, you know that regulation is coming. In fact, as I'm making this video, the executive order from Joe Biden was just handed out about, crypto regulation. That will be my next video. He also goes on to talk about how many companies like Dell and Microsoft, for instance, have both offered and then quietly discontinued payment services in crypto due to lack of demand. Once again, this is not particularly remarkable, as back in 2014, we were smack dab in the middle of the very first true crypto winter, triggered by the fall of Silk Road in 2013. This was horrible timing on their part. And such growing pains aren't surprising only 5 years into the adoption curve of a new technology with ambitions on this scale. Some people forget just how long it took for even something like email to gain a footing in the modern web. The end of this segment once again circles back to Rousseau's infinite machine as she gives examples of potential uses for blockchain technology.
I love this paragraph because it outlines just how disconnected from reality the people actually building cryptocurrencies really are. They don't understand anything about the ecosystems they're trying to disrupt. They only know that these are things that can be conceptualized as valuable and assume that because they understand one very complicated thing, programming with cryptography, that all other complicated things must be lesser in complexity and naturally lower in the hierarchy of reality, nails easily driven by the hammer that they have created.
The next chapter in the original Folding Ideas video, The Machine, is basically going to expand on this in detail and demonstrate how dumb crypto must sound if you only have a superficial or naive understanding of how it would be implemented. If you're using what amounts to basically a lengthy puff piece that paints in broad strokes meant to be digestible by as many people as possible to understand the relevance of smart contract platforms, this is not an unreasonable conclusion to come to. But as we'll see shortly, the devil is in the details, and attributing the naivete of a tech outsider to the crypto developers they're glorifying can put you in a weird place. That's not to say that some industries originally seen as potential targets for disruption might not ultimately prove incompatible with what blockchain has to offer, or only benefit marginally from blockchain technology. Only that the move from concept to proof of concept and finally to viable product and then finished product involves a lot of R&D. Nowhere is this better exemplified than this gem right at the end of the Ethereum chapter.
The idea of putting medical records on a public, decentralized, trustless blockchain is absolutely nightmarish, and anyone who proposes it should be instantly discredited. The fact that Rousseau fails to question any of this is journalistic malpractice.
As they say, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and we're going to hammer pretty deep on this little soundbite in the next chapter. The next chapter actually contains a lot of points that he will then flesh out a little later on in the video, so at this point, we're going to start jumping around to consolidate his points on crypto, as a lot of the remaining runtime is dedicated more to NFTs and arguments that can stand alone without the criticism of crypto. It starts by detailing the distinction between blockchain ledgers and consensus mechanisms, an important distinction to make. At around the 27-minute mark, he goes over proof-of-stake consensus, which he introduces fairly well. I won't rehash all of that here, as I've already made that video, and instead, we're going to linger a moment to analyze proof-of-stake consensus from a few angles. I'm going to assume you understand the basics of proof-of-stake for this part, and I'm also going to warn you right up front that we are going to get a little into the weeds here, and this whole section is not going to be very casual-friendly at all. So you might want to jump to the next video chapter if you find yourself getting a little overwhelmed. So first we're going to try and build a case for proof-of-stake over proof-of-work, and then we're going to go ahead and start tearing that case down. You'll recognize some of this case for proof-of-stake if you follow Vitalik Buterin's blog posts. Part of the security proposition for a good consensus mechanism is that the cost of attack should be greater than the cost of defense. This asymmetry is a basic function of pre-quantum cryptography. To be honest, I'm not sure anyone fully understands the implications of quantum computing to cybersecurity and cryptography just yet. On top of on-chain consensus, there's the very real aspect of social consensus, and the idea that trying to convince the world at large to adopt a compromise chain over the legitimate chain is going to be virtually impossible in the long term. Note that we're talking about attacks here. We'll come back to the idea of simultaneous block generation and forks of that nature later. That social consensus is a slower, long-term mechanism, while on-chain consensus handles everything faster and prevents infinite disagreements between people. With regard to Sybil attacks, some have proposed a model of 3 E's of resistance: entry cost, existence cost, or maintenance cost, but that doesn't start with an E, and exit cost. So proof of work traditionally has no exit cost and has to compensate for with a rising existence cost. Proof of work offers incentives in the form of block rewards to bring this existence cost into being and sets up a race mechanic so that the network naturally grows to increase security and decentralization. This is important because it's very hard to recover from attacks in a proof of work framework, and therefore the size of the network and the consequent cost of attack has to become too big to fail. Aside from the long-term energy consumption concerns, this brings the attack to defense cost essentially even, and simply assumes that nobody will be willing and or able to make the attack. which had better not happen, because after the first hard fork, where we fork away from ASIC mining back to, GPU miners, there's really no chance to repeatedly fork away from attack chains in proof of work. The standard proof of stake answer to this is to introduce an asymmetry between attack cost and defense cost via slashing. Put simply, this is when you take away staked funds if malicious or irrational behavior is detected. Further, protocols can be designed to limit how profitable malicious behavior can be, and they're capable of multiple forks if needed to eliminate the value of stolen funds. However, the idea is to set the cost of such attacks so high and the benefits so low that you would never actually have to utilize this mechanism. On top of this, simply going out and buying a bunch of chains or coins to try and achieve a 51% majority in order to attack a chain doesn't really make a lot of economic sense. Doing so in large enough numbers to make a difference would drive up the price dramatically by, raising buying pressure, lowering selling pressure for a good chunk of holders. In doing so, you'd likely be making so much money from capital gains and staking on top of that, you might as well just participate legitimately in the network. You would eventually be paying way above asking price to accumulate that hoard if you want to get to roughly the 66% you'd want to perform a double spend. And even then, profiting from double spending or shorting the chain is a lot harder in the real world these days than you'd expect. Okay, so that's kind of the basic argument for proof of stake, notably proof of stake without on-chain governance. Next, let's go ahead and introduce some of the principles set forth by Cardano, the chain started by IOHK, well, I guess now IOG, Input-Output Global, that has on-chain governance. This is going to kind of resemble the discussion that Dan Olson has about DAOs. Without on-chain governance, malicious behavior has to be a bit more complicated, as for most people, owning large amounts of one asset will simply be seen as overexposure, and attacks will require more technical expertise. But with on-chain governance, all it takes is high enough ownership to legally serve your own interests in any way you want using purely protocol-driven actions. Many criticize this as plutocracy established proof of stake, whereas other people say that, all proof of stake is plutocracy established. What puts Cardano in the spotlight here is actually that it doesn't have slashing, which is cited as a solution to the nothing at stake problem, which we'll go over shortly when we talk about criticisms of proof of stake. Their thinking is based on formal peer-reviewed research into game theory that suggests that given sufficient decentralization and the establishment of what's called a Nash equilibrium, which we'll explain presently, slashing isn't really necessary. In a Nash equilibrium, there is no incentive for any individual to change their original strategy. Players are assumed to start out not cooperating, and they are assumed to know the strategies of other players. Although in this case, they can really only surmise that each participant in the network will do what profits them the most. Now, one of those assumptions, namely the one that the players are not colluding, can't actually be left as an assumption. That's where sufficient decentralization comes in. Both pool operators and delegators are both rewarded for block production, positively incentivizing everyone involved. At the same time, there's a parameter called K, above which a reward to a single staking pool encounters diminishing returns. This incentivizes large pools. Well, what it ultimately ends up doing is having them cut their own power into multiple pools, with the new smaller pools then receiving less opportunities to produce new blocks and thus being inherently less powerful and profitable. But of course, they still belong to the same owner. There's also no lockup period to staking, so that any malicious behavior by a pool operator can be punished immediately by the community by simply moving to a different pool. They also argue that slashing is regressive. Presenting disproportionate risk to the poor, and halting, where funds are frozen to hedge against bad behavior, hinders use as a currency. This explains some of Cardano's economic setup, but what about its on-chain governance? It basically uses a one coin, one vote quadratic voting scheme. The outlook for this is not very good. Recall that IOG publishes peer-reviewed research on all of their major solutions. They specifically released a paper regarding the egalitarianism of proof of work versus proof of stake. And while they found that economically, proof of stake is more egalitarian than proof of work under certain assumptions. They straight up say that blockchain systems are, for the time, plutocratic with regard to one coin, one vote. And this is as good a place as any to start ripping into proof of stake. Stake-based systems can be easily distorted by governments by simply blocking on-ramps. Restricting fiat to crypto bank transfers are all that it would take in order to stop the chain's growth, leaving only the option to convert back to fiat, producing an environment that is all sell pressure and no buy pressure. Alternatively, if a government simply started accepting a proof-of-stake asset as taxes, they then could turn around and start staking that coin and then gain a controlling share of that on-chain stake over time. Chains with on-chain governance would be particularly susceptible to this tactic, as the government could take over without even trying. At least with proof of work, the government can't selectively shut off the buying of electricity in order to mine new coins into existence. Mixed proof of stake / proof of work solutions like Decred might present solutions to this, but pure proof of stake does not. Proof of stake naturally tends to centralize chains over time, and it's not hard to see why. Those who have the most at stake explicitly gain the most. Now, this tends to happen with proof of work as well via mining rigs a few different ways. So this point is more on a spectrum than a binary thing. Now, this tends to happen with proof of work as well via mining rigs in a few different ways. So this point is more on a spectrum than a binary thing. But on the other side of that, the massive energy savings of proof of stake over proof of work actually allows massive amounts of validation power to be concentrated on a single computer, whereas proof of work remains geographically mobile, no matter how few entities actually own the machines. Also, to be fair to proof of stake here, there are some solutions like, coin age-based validator selection. So there's potential ways around this. But this may not be appropriate for every consensus protocol. In theory, another potential vector of attack for proof-of-stake chains is what's called slashing sabotage. If you can cause enough staked coins to be slashed simultaneously, the chain would lose quorum and the whole thing would be frozen until some central authority was able to put things right again. Now, we've never actually seen this done, as it's another one that would be very difficult to actually profit from in like a double spend, given that you'd immediately screw the network your wealth is on, but if it was done, it would be catastrophic. We also mentioned the nothing at stake problem earlier, which we'll talk about now in conjunction with the problem of forks. Now, proof of stake consensus protocols are inherently going to be more complicated than proof of work consensus protocols, and this is for a variety of reasons. One shining example of this is how forks are dealt with. In proof of work, the solution for determining which fork is legitimate is actually fairly simple. Let the miners mine, and whichever fork gets the most proved work wins. In proof of work, you no longer have that proven work that you can look at, and you have a new potential security flaw in the form of the nothing at stake problem. Basically, an attacker creates a fork one block before they spend coins, and then they continue to mint only on their chain. As others are incentivized to mint on all possible chains to ensure that they get paid no matter who wins, the double spend chain wins, and the attack is successful. Once again, we've never seen a nothing at stake attack actually done in real life, but it is theoretically possible. Ethereum's Casper consensus mechanism, which is going to be its proof of stake, attempts to solve this by requiring stake to be locked up as like a security deposit of sorts. Time will tell exactly how successful this is going to end up being. But the fact remains, however, that proof of stake has to create more elaborate protocols to deal with its many edge cases in the absence of provable work. Another issue is that at this point we actually have mathematical proof that weak subjectivity is a hard requirement of all proof of stake chains. To quote a forum post by a Stacks user, if a node has been disconnected for a sufficiently long period of time or is bootstrapping and is presented with two conflicting transactional histories, then it's impossible for it to determine which one is the true chain without some external input. This is because it is impossible to know whether or not the committee that validates the chain is majority honest or not. This is because it's impossible to know whether or not the committee that validates the chain is majority honest and not post facto corrupted, i.e. attacker controlled. In practice, this means that the user will have to resolve the conflict out of band, using some a priori knowledge about the honesty of the chain's current committee. This is not the case for proof-of-work chains, where the valid chain with the most cumulative proof of work is always the true chain. Now, there's ways around this, like the generation of per-block consensus hashes, but this is just one more thing in the already long list of things that you have to consider when you're constructing a proof-of-stake consensus protocol. This doesn't necessarily mean proof-of-stake is unworkable, just that it's very hard to work. With regard to on-chain governance and the achievement of a Nash equilibrium, one of the main assumptions behind that is that the staking pool operators can only form a single pool. As you probably picked up a moment ago, this is explicitly not how things work. Even on Cardano, the pioneer of this idea. The pool that I use, Goat Stake, has like 3 pools, and they're all called Goat Stake. There's no way around this without revealing the identities of stake pool operators, which some operators do willingly anyway, but not all. And even if you did use a solution like that, there are workarounds, like starting a pool under the name of a family member, or making multiple competing entities that you control and just happen to play nice with each other. A plutocracy will form under all existing on-chain governance structures, and this applies to DAOs as well, so I do agree with that section of the original video. More on this with regard to Cardano. I'll link some sources in the description if you'd like to take a look.
Proof of stake also even more explicitly rewards the wealthy who have the capital to both stake and spend. It's also even more explicitly exclusionary. Ethereum's proposed proof of stake migration has a buy-in of 32 Ether, which at the time of writing is about $130,000. So really only early adopters and the wealthy can actually meaningfully participate for more than just crumb.
Very valid criticism here. Now, it should be noted that you can stake much smaller amounts on exchanges, and there are staking pools that you can use to get in on the staking game. So that barrier to entry isn't directly passed on to smaller investors, and indeed, that is the way it was planned. So we should be aware that there's multiple reasons why this particular scheme was chosen. There are trade-offs between decentralization, finality time, and network overhead. How many validators there are relates to the computational expense of attestation aggregation, and factoring in the plan for 64 shards, they have to be able to ensure consensus and scaling on each shard. They've essentially chosen a solution that aims at low overhead, low finality time, and relatively low base layer decentralization in exchange for staking pool-based decentralization. So they want you to stake, they just want you to do it in a staking pool. However, this necessarily does take power away from those investors all the same, as they cannot have any say at all if they can't pool together at least that much ETH. And if the price goes up from there, which it likely will, that barrier to entry and subsequent abstraction of power will only worsen. This setup strikes me as suboptimal, but I don't really claim to be an expert in the matter. Does this actually provide a good compromise between performance and decentralization? Does betting on staking pools to maintain decentralization and access for poorer participants actually work? Let me know what you think down in the comments.
This is, in turn, compounding inherent problems with the long-term growth of the chain. Even if you solve the escalating power requirements of proof of work, the data requirements of storing the chain and participating as a validator are also prohibitive in a way that inevitably centralizes power in the hands of a few wealthy operators.
85 terabytes per year is totally fine, right? Like, because 85 terabytes per year, like, if you have even one person that just keeps buying, like, a $100 hard drive, like, I think once every month, then they can store it, right? Like, it's something like that. So it's too big for just, like, a casual user that just wants to run the chain on their laptop, but one dedicated user who cares, like, they can totally afford to store the chain. And so 85 terabytes is not a big deal, right? But once you crank that number higher, there comes a point at which it starts becoming a really big deal.
Now, that clip that Folding Ideas plays is from the Bankless podcast, about 40 minutes into a discussion with Vitalik. I have a question for you. Why do you think they were discussing this? Do you think Vitalik and 2 huge crypto fanboys on their crypto podcast were for 2 hours straight just trying to tell people about how crypto is bunk and issues like size and scalability are why? I'll give you a moment to think about whether that makes any sense. Your answer? Okay, great. Now, I'm going to go ahead and play some other parts of that same podcast, and you can decide for yourself what exactly is going on.
Now, why is that useful? One reason why that's useful is that it allows validators to be much lighter. Validators would not have to have this big, heavy database. Validators could just only verify blocks that they need to verify in real time, right? So as a validator, you would not need to have a big hard drive. You would theoretically be able to just do everything in RAM. So it will be scalable, faster, much easier to set up, much more convenient. So the experience as a validator will be much more decentralized. We want to completely move away from this idea of like users verifying things by re-executing them, right? So like ZK Snark the EVM, so that users don't even have to don't have to run the EVM. ZK Snark the beacon chain transition, so that users don't have to run the beacon chain transition. ZK Snark signature verification, so users don't have to verify signatures, right? So basically get to the point where the only person who needs to actually run the EVM and actually like run the beacon chain like state transition function and run any of that stuff is whoever is creating the block. Everyone else just verifies one Snark, and that one Snark lets them verify the entire block. That makes it extremely easy for anyone to run a node.
And then the whole rest of the body has been ZK Snark. So it's this tiny little tail that's connected to this normal sized head. And that's how Ethereum just becomes super ultra lightweight.
Exactly. No, yes, Ethereum today is not like the layer 1 is not a system that's ready for like direct mass adoption by users. But that's exactly why we've been like harping the drum of scalability in layer 2s and sharding and all these things like since 2014, right?
Feel free to make your own conclusions. Now, this is a pretty logical place to start talking about rollups and layer 2 scaling solutions, a few of which we've already alluded to. We may as well let Vitalik start us off here as well.
So basically, rollups by themselves are a layer 2 scaling solution, and the way rollups work is that computation and storage go off-chain, but data stays on-chain, right? And this allows transactions to happen much more cheaply than they would if everything is done on layer 1, but they still inherit the security of layer 1.
At this point, you're probably getting the impression that this is a realm that involves a lot of technical jargon and requires a lot of little details to really understand. And that's true. So my goal here isn't going to be to provide a full technical breakdown of every rollup or every type of layer 2 scaling solution, and certainly not to promote any one of these as being optimal one that the whole space should adopt, but rather to provide a brief overview of what's out there and how layer 2 seeks to address many of the problems mentioned in the Folding Ideas video. There's a variety of layer 2 scaling projects out there. Bitcoin's Lightning Network, Bitcoin's Liquid Network, Parastate, Arbitrum, rollups like Optimism and ZK rollups, and Plasma with variants like Polygon Plasma. We'll go over 3 of these, state channels and Plasma, which are completely off-chain solutions, and rollups, which keep data on-chain. Let's start with state channels, as we've already mentioned Bitcoin's Lightning Network multiple times already, and we haven't really elaborated on exactly what that is. State channels, put simply, are just payment channels between 2 individuals that can be used for multiple payments without interacting with the underlying layer 1 blockchain for each one. Fees, for example, in the Lightning Network, are typically paid when opening the channel, which typically requires something like depositing currency into a smart contract or multi-sig wallet or some such, and when closing the channel out again, so that a miner is paid to add the final state update to the layer 1. These can be made bidirectional, such that both participants can pay each other back and forth. They have composability, such that if A has a channel open with B and B has a channel open with C, A can also interact with C. This property has implications for privacy, as you couldn't see exactly what amounts were transferred at what times to whom within the channel. Only the final ledger update once the channel is closed. And of course, since you can make multiple transactions without any mining involved, the success of Lightning or any other state channel network decreases the amount of proof-of-work mining required to secure the Bitcoin network, and it drastically decreases the minimum transaction amount that you could justify using the Bitcoin network for. You could indeed buy the KFC Bitcoin bucket using the Lightning network quickly and at a reasonable cost. You just keep a state channel open with KFC and use it for multiple transactions. Now, the way I've communicated it here, it all sounds fairly simple, but the real-life implementation is actually far more complex. Now, there's actually multiple good criticisms of the concept, and I was going to try and go into a detailed discussion of them in this video, but the more I read, the more I realized it's a fairly complex subject, and I'm probably going to have to make its own video for that, but we'll go into a couple of those here. For instance, how would you deal with larger payments? Would the hub and spoke model of Lightning eventually just go into a replica of basically the current model that we have right now? Since everything is done off-chain until the channel is closed, isn't the channel itself vulnerable to a host of new attack vectors? Are these new attack vectors worth introducing? Can they be shored up? Would the effect on fees and mining actually have a negative impact on the blockchain as a whole? Suffice it to say, there's a lot of potential issues, some that are bigger problems than others. More on these in a future video. Next, let's talk about Plasma, and then we'll touch on Polygon Plasma. Plasma is an Ethereum scaling solution, popularized in 2017 in a white paper by Vitalik and Joseph Poon. who himself was also one of the developers working on Bitcoin's Lightning Network. It's a layer 2 framework for what's referred to as minimum viable plasma, or MVP, that can be adapted to various different layer 1s. It started out as an Ethereum concept, but it can actually be made platform agnostic. Chains like the OMG network or Polygon adapt plasma architecture for form things like more viable plasma and Polygon plasma, respectively. Plasma, like state channels, is a way of pretty much moving everything off-chain, including data and computation. Viable plasma involves the creation of child chains that are connected to their parent chains, like, say, Ethereum, through what are called root contracts. So basically, these side chains function independent of their parent chains as independent blockchains that propose commits to their parent blockchains, with new blocks being subject to a challenge period so that they can be potentially challenged and then verified with fraud proofs before they're actually committed to the parent chain. So by this mechanism, the parent chain still retains primacy over the plasma chains, with child chains offloading the computation requirements for arbitrarily many dApps while requiring pretty minimal interaction with their parent chains. This was thought to be a pretty huge boon for Ethereum scaling, given that it was entering the age of congestion and high fees. Now, Plasma has some pretty serious drawbacks. For one, its security was contingent on everybody keeping an eye out on every transaction for fraud, which actually imposes a pretty not insignificant overhead on everyone using a child chain. As well, if everyone mass exited as a response to fraud, it would just blast the parent chain with a slew of new data that it couldn't possibly handle. And for everyone that wanted to exit the child chain, you'd have to put up with a 7-day challenge period in order to do that, which sucks. Now, these days, people have generally kind of given up trying to get around these major challenges with Plasma. There was a push toward, representing coin ownership through NFTs, which was an attempt to adjust the proof requirements within the network and get around the mass exit problem. And this was called Plasma Cash. But most of these efforts have basically come to naught. And at this point, the kind of layer 2 scaling discussion in the space has moved all the way over to Rollups now. We're not really thinking in terms of moving everything all the way off chain anymore. Indeed, even the aforementioned OMG network has at this point pretty much transitioned all the way to optimistic rollups, which, as we'll discuss shortly, will likely give way in the long term to ZK rollups. The project that most includes Plasma technology today is basically Polygon. It has a Plasma bridge, and this was formerly known as Matic Network. But really, that's not all they do. They actually use a combination of Plasma, optimistic rollups, ZK rollups, and then they use all of these in conjunction to reduce fees and increase scalability, with the understanding that new technologies will be incorporated as they are conceived and refined. Now let's talk about ZK rollups and the various iterations therein. First, before we really talk about ZK rollups, we have to discuss about what a ZK snark is. A ZK snark is a zero-knowledge, succinct, non-interactive argument of knowledge. These are basically just cryptographic proofs that allow one party to have certain information which they get to keep secret throughout the whole process, while at the same time proving that their information is valid without ever revealing any of it. Instead of revealing said information, instead, they provide a mathematical proof called a zero-knowledge proof, which can easily be verified. This technology enables things like proving your credit score is high enough for a DeFi protocol without ever actually revealing your identity or even your credit score. If that sounds like magic, it's because without a technical grasp of cryptographic mathematics, it might as well be. I won't even pretend that I can explain the details. Keep these in mind, as we will run into ZK snarks again when we get to the part about medical records. ZK rollups batch transactions using Merkle trees that are then translated into a ZK snark that serves as a validity proof, which shows that the output of the rollup is the correct output of the computation that was moved off-chain. This proof can be verified very quickly, regardless of how much computation went into it. Rollups, whether zero-knowledge or optimistic, have a fixed cost per batch, and ZK rollups, though, have a lower per transaction on-chain gas cost. These are useful for both increasing the scalability of a chain, theoretically adding something like 570x to the TPS of Ethereum, and for, adding to the privacy of transactions. One drawback of these systems that's been criticized is that there's actually technically a requirement for a third party to set up the zero-knowledge proof system in the first place, which is a potential vector of attack. These days, there's actually an improved version of ZK Snarks called ZK Starks, zero-knowledge, scalable, transparent arguments of knowledge. These don't require a third party, but that technology, while very promising, is technically still more in an alpha stage of development. ZK Starks are supposedly also more scalable in terms of computational speed and size, as well as being actually resistant to attack by quantum computers. A more involved version of this technology is the recursive zero-knowledge proof, which is basically the key to how what's called MENA protocol works. That's another blockchain. MENA's zero-knowledge technology is recursive, meaning that they basically take zero-knowledge proofs of a batch of transactions and then batch that batch with another batch and then take a proof of that batch and so on and so forth. Basically, it's like if you prove that you had two things by taking a picture of those two things, and then you have two more things you have to, prove that you have. So you take the picture that you already had, put the two things next to that, and then you take a picture of all of those, and then you just basically keep doing that. The entire chain is compressed in this way to a total size of 22 kilobytes, and it stays at that size. An incredible feat in the modern world of crypto. Vitalik has said that something similar is in the works for the future of Ethereum, and Ethereum and MENA have actually been working together to try and, refine the technology. Next, Folding Ideas goes over a real-world example of how blockchain could be implemented, and as we'll see more than once in this video, he does a decent job of laying out broad concepts, but then fails to look for any solutions in the details.
One of the big selling points of all this technology is that it's particularly secure. Very difficult for anyone to hack it directly since there's so much redundancy. A lot of hay is made about the system's resiliency against man-in-the-middle attacks, which are your classic Hollywood hacker-type attacks.
Now, this is both true and irrelevant for exactly the reasons Dan is about to point out to us. Dan is going to tell us about how most fraud is not the man-in-the-middle type, and rather a matter of people inputting information that was actually wrong in the first place, thus making blockchains pretty unhelpful in the world of fraud. He also goes on to say that given the decentralized nature of the blockchain, the need for this type of security was actually introduced by the blockchain itself, a problem it introduced and then purported to solve. Now, there's two main points I'd like to make about this. First, it's not really the Hollywood hacker types that people are afraid of here. It's the governments and institutions that can kind of change the rules whenever they see fit. Recall my example from earlier of the everyday practice of banks rearranging transaction history to try and maximize overdraft fees. Something that Folding Ideas readily admits is essentially a poverty tax. This is only one of the many issues with the traditional banking system, the Fed's outsized power being a much bigger relevant example to today's economic situation. It's seen as worthwhile to take power away from these entities and eliminate the capriciousness of that system. And the hurdle that needs to be overcome in that case is, as Dan points out, the vulnerability to man-in-the-middle attacks. So the point that blockchain introduced these problems and then purported to solve them, that's the motivation. That was literally the point. Of course, if you want to cut these people out, you're gonna have to solve the man-in-the-middle problem, because these are the normal men in the middle. You want to cut them out, so you need to be able to basically perform their function in a way that's safe for people to use. That's the point. Second, you'll note that nowhere in that first point did I say anything about having to solve input fraud. As Dan points out, input fraud already exists in the world of physical records and digital Web 2 records. To say that blockchain doesn't solve these problems and is therefore an inefficient, useless, and redundant system is like saying evolution is nonsense because it doesn't solve abiogenesis, which is a common argument used by religious people to deny evolution. Of course, the answer to this is that evolution doesn't propose to solve abiogenesis. That's a whole nother question. Evolution describes how life, which is presupposed to exist in its framework, evolves through mutations and selection pressures. Evolution, as we understand it now, is inherently not about abiogenesis. Similarly, ways to handle things like input fraud have existed completely independent of blockchains for some time now. Now, I'd rather not turn this into like a half-hour rundown of how exactly fraud is prevented at the various different stages, but we'll go over some of the basic concepts, terminology, and methods here. In general, there's three sides to the so-called triangle of fraud, right? So there's opportunity, pressures, and rationalization. When constructing a profile of fraudsters, motive is also taken into account. So some are predatory and, very intentional. Some are opportunistic or even accidental. Note that a similar issue to what's presented with regard to blockchains was also seen with computers and the internet. Indeed, what's good about computers also makes them more vulnerable. Databases are large and access privileges can be difficult to create and enforce, making theft, destruction, or alteration of data easier and quicker. The desire to allow employees, customers, and vendors access to their organization's system also creates greater exposure. Once a computer system is altered or accessed, it remains that way until the system is no longer used or the breach is discovered. Once a computer system is altered or accessed, it essentially remains that way until the breach is discovered or the system is no longer in use. So these trade-offs already exist in the web as it exists today, but they're deemed worthwhile given the benefits that come with them. We'll come back to this shortly, so just tuck that away in your noggin. The existing solutions to the problem of fraud, including cyber fraud, include pre-employment screening, policies on non-use or confidentiality of information, personnel review policies, error correction control built into the system, separation of duties, separation of functions, signatures and counter-signatures, and job rotations policies. Notice that nowhere in that list does blockchain or anything that even resembles it enter into the picture. Something that requires a physical action by a physical person, like, for instance, input fraud, is dealt with in a real world by policies and safeguards that watch over people physically. This is not where blockchain comes into play. So where does it come into play? Glad you asked, because that leads us into Dan's next point as we start talking about whether or not blockchains can revolutionize the shipping industry.
First, the things that blockchain is capable of tracking are things that manufacturers and shippers are already tracking, or at least trying to track. So this is not so much revolution as it would be standardization.
Whoa. Hold on there just a second. So immediately we run into folding ideas, kind of presenting the general concept with a token qualifier before confidently making a statement that's a lot more arguable than he makes it seem. As always, the devil is in the details here, so let's talk about the details. How is it exactly that blockchain technology could change the shipping industry? First, let's motivate this discussion by talking about what problems the shipping industry might have to solve in the first place. Shipping delays, often caused by slow, manual administrative processes, have massive financial ramifications. The average time it takes for funds to reach invoicing companies is about 42 days, leading to hundreds of billions of dollars sitting stagnant each day. Processing and administration costs can comprise nearly a fifth of total transportation costs because of the labor-intensive and error-prone nature of the industry's manual document handling. Furthermore, high volumes of canceled orders, unpredictable cargo movements, and cargo loss are costly problems made worse by the lack of real-time information available to the companies in question. The ability to track and correct an issue in a timely manner depends on reliable access to data, something traditional business practices prevent when shipments are tracked in the margins of hard copy paperwork. There's also issues regarding bills of lading, forms that detail the amounts, types, and destinations of the things carried in a shipment. A bill of lading provides all the information necessary to process a document for both the carrier and shipper, while also serving as a receipt, contract, and document of ownership of the goods. These are typically physical documents that are mailed to ports and arrive after the goods themselves. Note that input fraud is by no means the only concern when it comes to physical bills of lading. They can and are modified with inaccurate cargo descriptions, forged signatures, and false corporate logos. In other words, these are kind of the analog version of a man-in-the-middle attack when done after the initial bill is made. We should also note that shipping transactions these days are extremely inefficient and expensive. Digitizing paperwork alone costs an estimated $38 million a year and comes with its own carbon footprint. There's also a distinct lack of automation, with all transactions consequently requiring individual invoicing and bank transfer completion before they can go through, which introduces risk of loss due to, non-payment or, fluctuation in exchange rates. The U.S. Department of Transportation Maritime Administration compiled a report regarding the utility of blockchain technology in the shipping industry and have come up with 3 key areas which blockchain technology can improve the shipping industry: shipment tracking, smart bills of lading, and smart contracts. You can read the details for yourself in the description below. As for the impact of this, it kind of depends on how you define revolutionary, which is a largely semantic point I have no interest in litigating because, frankly, the benefits here speak for themselves. And we're not even done listing them, but do you see what I'm talking about here? Dan's little throwaway qualifier of, or at least trying to track, is literally where like 99% of the relevant information is hiding. But, his big picture conceptual talking points kind of focusing on things like input fraud, the abiogenesis to the issue at hand's evolution, keep him from kind of seeing the picture here.
Even that is built on a predicate assumption that everyone picks the same chain. It's an extremely optimistic assumption. Many firms deliberately want their information centralized and obfuscated to protect against corporate espionage. The lack of a shared, standardized bucket to put all the information into is not because it's been heretofore impossible, but because it's been undesirable.
So there's a couple of things we gotta unpack here. First, let's talk about that single chain idea, that everyone would have to agree to the same blockchain, right? This is blatantly false. If you're a crypto native in the modern era and you're not an Ethereum or Bitcoin maximalist, you know that the future is multi-chain. Chains like Polkadot and Cosmos are inherently built around this idea. We really don't even need to go any further on this, and I'm frankly a little taken aback that he even makes this point. But screw it, let's go a little further into it. Aside from the simple fact that multi-chain solutions are growing more available every single day, what else might motivate shipping companies and the companies they service to play nice in the blockchain space? Well, for one, the various inefficiencies that we listed above. On top of those, there are many more opportunities for, enhanced efficiency, cost reduction, and sustainability improvements. Shipping accounts for something like 3% of global carbon dioxide emissions. For one, the low-quality sulfurous bunker fuels used in cargo ships is pretty hard to track and trace because of note-based acquisition systems. As a result, it's pretty easy to mislead shippers on the origins and quality of said product. Projects like Bunker Trace are working to bring standardization to the industry with blockchain technology in order to make more consistent compliance with regulation easier. Furthermore, around $25 billion and 280 million tons of CO2 are lost to shipping containers crossing the ocean empty, which is a stupid way to generate 280 million tons of CO2. Filling this space by accurately tracking said vacancies in real time and then selling those vacancies in order to efficiently use that space is something that CubeX Global is tackling with blockchain technology right now. The paper bills of lading that we mentioned before are estimated to cost something like 400,000 trees per year. In conjunction with the trends and advancements in the space that we discussed earlier, these savings in carbon emissions add up pretty quickly when you consider that these same types of things can be seen in multiple industries. $25 billion, 280 million tons of CO2, and 400,000 trees a year. This is just a part of the shipping industry that we're going to be benefiting with blockchain technology. We should also at this point mention how this affects the effectiveness of government sustainability regulations. By storing information like fuel quality and standardized estimates of carbon emissions on blockchains, it makes it easier to monitor and report emissions, issue carbon credits, and otherwise streamline the process of complying with regulation. Many of the issues we've listed, if addressed, could be a huge boon with regard to the bottlenecking issues we've seen recently as a result of the pandemic and further offset the environmental impact of proof-of-work mining. Next, we come to his point about corporate espionage. Now, corporate espionage is a thing, and many companies do spend a lot of money trying to circumvent it. However, obfuscating shipping logs is not exactly a great way to do that. Yes, it might make, collecting and selling customer lists for espionage purposes more difficult, but as we noted, there's a pretty significant cost to doing so, not only to the shipping companies themselves, but to the companies they service. This particular type of corporate espionage is to corporate espionage what man-in-the-middle attacks are to traditional fraud. Not the biggest fish to fry. I mean, yeah, it's a common form of fraud. Don't get me wrong. It's a low-hanging fruit type of fraud. People sell that type of information all the time, but the hard-hitting type of corporate espionage typically has to do with trade secrets, not customer lists. On top of that, crypto provides many potential ways around certain forms of corporate espionage. Shipping containers are going to shipping ports and then distribution centers, but the actual transactions themselves could be significantly better hidden by simply using a very specific type of blockchain to make the transactions. Indeed, the crypto wallet that's being used by the customer doesn't have to actually have a person's identity attached to it. And depending on which blockchain is used, there would be a varying amount of difficulty figuring out who that person might be. If they happen to be using Monero, if they're really careful, there's a chance that you will never figure out who they are, if they're careful. If it's post-Taproot Bitcoin, there's going to be significantly less difficulty, but it's also not necessarily going to be super trivial, once again, if they're careful. Obfuscation, if that's what they're worried about, would more easily be done by simply using a more privacy-centered blockchain in order to effect those transactions. More importantly than anything I just said, do you really think that shipping companies are keeping themselves in the dark ages in order to protect the companies they're servicing from corporate espionage? This strikes me as quite the stretch, in the face of the factors already listed, but also given one last really important factor. The switch to blockchain is already happening en masse. Around half of maritime shipments already use blockchain technology in some form, and IBM's TradeLens is gaining serious traction. Not to mention some of the biggest cargo companies themselves forming the global shipping business network to provide greater blockchain access to other cargo companies. In short, the points about lack of benefits and corporate espionage don't stand up in the face of real-world use cases and rapid adoption.
The biggest issue that cryptocurrencies have suffered from is a lack of tangible things to actually use them on as currencies, rent or food or transit. This is for pretty simple reasons.
And now we're going to talk about the viability of cryptocurrencies as a medium of exchange. Now, I did say earlier that I don't necessarily support the use of Bitcoin specifically as an economy-level medium of exchange in its current form by itself. It's not the only supply-capped asset, and aside from that, there are plenty of assets that are not supply-capped. There are those with fixed monetary policies and those with variable monetary policies. Keep this in mind, and we'll continue a little bit with the video.
One is that the transaction fees on popular chains are so prohibitive that it's pointless to use them on any transaction that is in hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. No one is going to buy the Bitcoin bucket from their local KFC. Ethereum's main transaction fee, called gas, on a good day runs around $20 US per transaction, but that's severely optimistic.
So the issue of transaction fees is a very valid point here, especially with regard to Ethereum. That's a big one these days. It's a very spirited conversation. Once again, I'll refer you back to layer 2 scaling solutions from before, but let's also note that there are some layer 1 blockchains, the newer ones, that have more favorable fees and performance metrics like Solana and Avalanche. When I say lower fees, obviously you have to take into account the fact that there's less congestion, less use of these networks. But even accounting for that, models suggest that these lower fees to start with scale up pretty darn well, even if the network were to become more congested like Ethereum or Bitcoin. If you're starting off multiple orders of magnitude with lower fees, but even smaller than that in terms of actual usage, it goes to reason that once you get up there in terms of usage, those fees should remain lower than the current chains like Ethereum or Bitcoin. Now, this being said, with regard to Ethereum right now, this is a very valid criticism. It seems really obvious right now that they did not expect Ethereum to actually succeed as much as it did. Like, they said that they planned on succeeding, but they weren't actually prepared to succeed like this. They're a victim of their own success, and ultimately, it is a problem. It's a real problem.
These gas wars aren't localized to just the thing that's being fought over. If Steam is getting hammered because Concerned Ape posted Stardew Valley 2 by surprise, that will probably stay pretty well contained. If Taylor Swift concert tickets go on sale and Live Nation gets crushed, you might never even know. What those don't do is cause the cost of placing an order on DriveThruRPG to spike by 8,000% for 3 hours.
These are, once again, very valid criticisms of many layer 1s right now. This way, there's a switch to a lot of these layer 2s that move a lot of the computation and stuff off-chain and compartmentalize a lot of this network load so that one part shouldn't affect everything else if it just ends up being really, really popular. Now, there are actually a number of layer 1 type solutions that allow for this type of compartmentalization, particularly shard chains and alternative chain architectures like Ethereum's sharding model or even Cadena's chain web that we talked about before. However, most solutions that are meant to address this type of thing tend to focus on layer 2 these days. The main takeaway here is that this is by no means a necessary feature of all blockchains and is also by no means an insurmountable problem. Remember when you had to dial up the internet with your phone line? I do. Remember when the 2 megabyte download that you had going for the last couple of hours would get interrupted and potentially fail entirely if your mom made an unexpected phone call? I do. Remember when none of that was a problem when you came in to watch this video? Yeah, it's kind of like that. If we'd simply called the internet unworkable at a time when it lacked proper infrastructure and the technology wasn't as well developed, we wouldn't have gotten this far.
The second big reason is that value on the coins themselves is so volatile that unless you're willing to engage with the speculative nature of the coins, there's actually a huge risk in accepting them as payment for anything.
Absolutely true. And this is another reason why I don't necessarily think Bitcoin is ready to be used as a currency. And I don't really agree with the way El Salvador did their legal tender bill, where they fine companies for not accepting Bitcoin. Now, this is not necessarily to say that Bitcoin could never be used as a, currency once the volatility goes down at a higher market cap, like we were talking about earlier. Of course, I did already talk about how that volatility over time is going down. I'll refer you to that previous section. And next he'll bring up the issue of stablecoins, which is of course the crypto world's answer to this problem. So basically there's crypto coins that are pegged to the value of, say, the dollar or gold or yuan, whatever it is that you're trying to transact in. And they basically allow you to lock in gains via their own separate liquidity pools. Now, he does say that the point of crypto is to starve public services, which I take issue with. Governments are currently in the process of drafting policy regarding taxation of crypto assets, and I very much doubt that the lack of regulation and taxation in stablecoins is going to last much longer at all. If anything, crypto is about getting away from the perceived destabilizing effects of central bank monetary policies, which by debasing the currency have contributed to national debt burdens and incentivized our modern neglect of our public services. Then he goes on to address the 800-pound gorilla in the world of cryptocurrencies, Tether. This is a subject I've mentioned in my Risks in Crypto video, and I definitely share this concern about stablecoin regulation, which at this point is coming. Even high-profile crypto natives like Sam Bankman-Fried have testified to Congress about the need for things like daily attestations and regular audits in order to make sure that stablecoins are legitimately collateralizing and maintaining their pegs. And so this is likely what's going to happen in the future. And providers like Tether are going to have to start complying with the rules once they actually make them. Now, there's definitely problems in the space of stablecoins, but stablecoins are, at this point, a critical part of the decentralized finance infrastructure. If you'd like to find out more about the whole Tether issue in general, I would highly recommend CoffeeZilla's videos on the subject, which I'll link to in the description as well. He then points out that stablecoins are needed to add liquidity so that larger holdings can be cashed out. That's a particularly important argument if you're talking about things like countries evading sanctions. There's simply not the liquidity to do that and actually run an entire country's liquidity. We're using just crypto at this point. It's just not large enough of a liquidity source in order to do that. Not necessarily as important for our purposes right now. He then leads into the greater fool argument.
The whole thing operates by buying worthless assets, believing that you will later be able to sell them to a bigger fool.
Now, a pretty standard response to this, and one that I've personally used from time to time, is to point out that assets like housing, stocks, derivatives, and certainly collectibles like Pokemon cards or comics, all basically function on essentially the same principle. However, that logic, the way it's phrased there, does kind of miss the forest for the trees, as it were. While it's true that many assets that we've historically seen as being worthwhile to invest in do essentially require a so-called greater fool dynamic, that's not really the point. Really, the operative word here is worthless. Folding Ideas has spent most of the video so far trying, unsuccessfully, to undermine the use cases for crypto, and if you take him at his word, which by now you should probably realize that you shouldn't, that would potentially be a fair evaluation. If it's worthless, then truly you would have to be a greater fool in order to buy it. On top of this, if there's no adoption, then those use cases would even be irrelevant. But as we've already seen, and will continue to see throughout this video, there are use cases, and adoption is only growing. One can make a compelling case at this early stage regarding which crypto assets will or will not have staying power in the long term. But with every year that goes by, it seems less and less sensible to try and make the argument that none of them will. For more of my thoughts about the value of money and what intrinsic value means and how it applies to things like crypto assets, you can see the video in the top right. Next, we're going to skip ahead a little to Chapter 7, Crypto Reality. At around the hour and 20-minute mark, Folding Ideas comments on wallet managers, specifically MetaMask, which I'll only comment on briefly. Actually, JP Morgan essentially has a controlling stake in MetaMask at this point, which is a pretty important part of the Ethereum infrastructure, and that does not look good. So I'm not necessarily somebody who is like super committed to defending MetaMask, honestly. There are other better wallet managers in my opinion, but it is a very popular wallet manager, and there are some important concepts here that we should go over. There's various wallets you can use, both hot wallets, which are connected to the internet, and cold wallets that are not directly connected to the internet, which have varying levels of security and interoperability. MetaMask in particular was developed by Consensus in 2016 and has grown to integrate a lot of features. He points out that hot wallets like this present themselves as an obvious point of attack. Now, we should note that most hackers aren't really necessarily going to go through the effort of hacking a hot wallet for the payoff of one individual's crypto account, at least not at the moment. More commonly, what happens is that the hot wallets belonging to exchanges get hacked, and that's a great reason not to leave your money on the exchanges. Now, the fact remains that hot wallet attacks do happen, and with regard to MetaMask specifically, he brings up 2 points. One, that it doesn't obfuscate key phrases in the UI, and that the matter of two-factor authentication. If he's talking about private keys, you need that to load up the wallet in the first place, and presumably you're not dumb enough to just have that out in the open when you do it. Also, it doesn't straight up display your private keys unless you go into the menu and click on it, in which case, presumably you want it to be displayed. And if he's talking about public keys, those are truncated in the main UI so that you can't actually see it all, and they aren't displayed fully unless you go into your account details and look at it. And presumably, if you're going to do that, once again, you would want it displayed. Also, you can look up people's public keys on Etherscan. I know he knows this because he does it later with the overly attached girlfriend meme lady. But honestly, I don't know that I'm exactly following his point. I may have missed that one, so I don't have as much to say about it. I do have more to say about the two-factor authentication thing, because it does actually have two-factor authentication. It just doesn't call it that. MetaMask and many other hot wallets essentially have the option of linking to something like a Trezor or Ledger device. These are cold wallets that more or less act as the two-factor authentication for the hot wallet. Now, there are others, but those are the most popular ones that have, compatibility with the most number of hot wallets. Now, they specifically don't use the traditional SMS or app-based two-factor authentication because these are seen as third-party points of failure, whereas the cold wallet is a signature solution that is in your power, in your hands from start to finish. You have to have a physical device. You're the only one that has it. There isn't a third party that can out you to the government or otherwise, accidentally give your information to a hacker, because as he pointed out, that's often what happens. Real life hacking is just some dude calling the company and asking for, a connection through them. That's actually how most simjacking attacks work as well.
Remember, again, that these people want to put medical records, driver's licenses, professional accreditations, and real estate deeds into their system. They should not be trusted.
Look, we're not going to go into each and every one of these use cases individually because, frankly, I'm already getting tired of typing up this seemingly endless script. We're closing in on page 30, we're not nearly done yet, and I'm starting to get carpal tunnel at this point. We'll instead focus on one use case that was mentioned earlier, but only briefly touched upon to assure us of its absurdity: medical records. And this one is of particular interest to me as both a doctor and a patient.
How could anyone look at a public blockchain and think that private medical records belonged on it? Shouldn't they remain, well, private? Is Dan Olson somehow the only person smart enough to have noticed this? Well, it turns out there's an entire body of peer-reviewed literature on the subject, published not only in computer security journals, but also in medical systems journals by people with PhDs who definitely didn't forget about the standard of privacy expected from personal medical records. This is not an afterthought to them. Blockchain-based data preservation systems, or DPS, are the subject of intensive R&D that can provide privacy via... But hold on, before we skip straight to answers here, let's motivate the discussion. Why would we even consider blockchains in medical record systems? What problems can be solved? So, hospitals store patient medical records in their databases, and when a doctor needs a prescription record, the service system extracts the required data from the database. However, as data stored in these databases can be stolen or tampered with or even deleted completely, the accuracy of these records can't actually be verified. If the data are submitted to third-party notarization companies for verification and preservation, personal information may be leaked, and ultimately it's difficult to guarantee the reliability and availability of preservation because the third party's credibility can't actually be confirmed except from external standards set by yet another third party. This is where the immutability property of blockchains comes into play. There's also the growing threat of ransomware attacks on hospitals. The basic form of an attack like this is that attackers gain access to a hospital's EMR and then encrypt the data therein. Then they require a ransom in return for the decryption key. Now, this has been happening more recently, and ultimately it's also becoming more and more easy to actually carry out an attack like this. There are actually black market sites where you can buy the software and technology that you need to do something like this in a turnkey fashion. There are literally groups that make this software and make it easy to use so that you can just hold a hospital hostage, basically. And ultimately, the benefits of blockchain technology for this particular use case is pretty self-explanatory. You can't hold the entire Ethereum smart contract platform hostage from any single entity. In order to set up a blockchain solution, we have to ensure a few basic things. So for one, no one except the authorized institution has to have access to the patient's private medical data. For non-clinical purposes, for instance for research purposes, it may be important that a patient needs to prove that their data meets the standards that that institution is looking for in their studies. Even more important for both clinical and non-clinical purposes, any entity that a patient releases their information to needs to make sure that that data can be recorded and acknowledged, but only in a way that protects that patient's privacy. So then we come back to how can we solve these problems with blockchain technology? Well, there's many potential solutions, and we're going to go over a number of them. But just remember that at this point, we're at a very early phase in, research in general into this field. People are still proposing and prototyping ideas to see which might work the best for this particular use case. An early paper by Lee et al. 2018 in the Journal of Medical Systems presented an Ethereum-based DPS that used things called proofs of primitiveness, which at its later iterations can potentially include things like symmetric key cryptography that can be used to assure the privacy of personal data. They proposed data storage schemes and multimodal cryptographic approaches to enhance security, which allow records to be preserved permanently and which allow for verification to check for tampering. Now, we see that many previous approaches actually avoided storing data, the actual medical records, on-chain, for exactly the reasons that Folding Ideas has pointed out. And indeed, we even see more recent approaches like Lavagna et al. 2021 in wireless personal communications are actually hybrid approaches of cloud and blockchain integration. Lee et al.'s paper was one of the early complex schemes published in a peer-reviewed journal that found some ways around the inconvenient publicity of blockchains for this use. Under the proposed setups, even if one were to gain inappropriate access to those medical records, they would not be readily human readable without a particular key. Now, the paper I'm referring to does emphasize that ultimately these are still prototype schemes and they're not necessarily being sold as ready for prime time just yet, but it's an interesting possibility. A variety of approaches have been proposed to maximize privacy on blockchain medical record systems. In 2018, Chen et al. Described a system where patients receive their medical records from an institution after having seen their doctor, and they're given a private key. They then have to verify the institution's signature, and then they send it back, which generates another encryption key that is stored on the cloud. The usage rights of the medical data are completely in control of the user, and patients may authorize any third-party agency to access some of their medical data through access control mechanisms, and that allow them to withdraw their consent and authorization at any time. To limit the usefulness of on-chain analysis and unmasking patient identities, a few systems have been proposed. Chowdhury proposed a zero-knowledge provable mixing scheme, and Park et al. Suggested the use of ZK snarks, which we've already talked about earlier in the video. Others have suggested the use of biometric backups in case private keys are lost, while Medical Chain, a specialty chain that has already been deployed in research contexts, uses a bracelet that can be scanned in the case of this eventuality. Now, we should note that even as recently as April 2021, a review by Fang et al. In the Journal of Medical Internet Research showed that the most common models being researched right now include permissioned blockchains and off-chain storage. So when all is said and done, a permissionless on-chain solution may not end up being optimal for this particular use. Some models simply tether the blockchain to existing EMR applications. Public distributed decentralized object storage networks like NeoFS, which could end up being critical infrastructure for blockchain implementations in multiple industries, are also being researched as a potential solution in some models. The takeaway here overall is that only a few blockchain medical record system solutions have actually been deployed so far, and the whole field is in such an early stage right now that it's hard to say what the final form of this idea will end up being.
Why try to brute force your bad data onto the chain when you can trick someone into giving you access to their wallet, then transfer all their stuff out? Every smart contract becomes a self-rewarding bug bounty where the payout is whatever apes and coins you can grab before anyone notices. And that's not even touching on the subject of malware. Smart contracts are just code. They're software. There's no reason they can't be viruses or worms. The primary limitation is processing power. But also, it's a virus that someone can drop directly into your bankless bank account and just wait for you to activate it. And yeah, that's right. There's no offer/confirmation step in sending tokens back and forth. Someone who knows your wallet can just drop stuff right into it.
So this line of thinking applies both to NFTs and any dApps you may interact with, and that's why I'm responding to it at all, because once again, I'm not an NFT guy, and this is strictly a defense of crypto. Now, while the concept of viruses in their traditional sense are not really viable on most blockchains simply because of gas fees, and as he mentioned, the processing power limitations, although there is a workaround with multiple parallel smart contracts called a K-Airy structure, which is not typically very common to my knowledge. The concept of NFT malware and malicious dApps is absolutely a thing. Now, the cop-out way of addressing this would be to simply remind people that these risks exist in the web as we have it right now, that these risks are present much more commonly than you would think, and that common sense low-tech security ideas like, double-checking destination keys when sending funds in the case of keyloggers, using a cold wallet as a form of two-factor authentication, never interacting with an unexpected asset drop, and never entering your keys into a phishing site are common low-tech solutions to the problem. And while all of this is true, especially the cold wallet thing, everyone should have a cold wallet if you have a significant amount of crypto. But anyway, while all of that is true, the The concept of a bankless bank being infiltrated on a whim and the users being left with no recourse is definitely something that warrants further discussion. I must confess, not being an NFT guy, I hadn't really thought this particular aspect of it through, and actually, I have to thank Folding Ideas for bringing it up. I actually have a few of these malware NFTs in my Soulflare wallet and never interacted with them out of a sheer lack of interest, but had no idea why they were there exactly. At the same time, that account is backed by my physical cold wallet signature, and no assets can be sent out of the account without my physical cold wallet signature, and no smart contract can really bypass that. Since my cold wallet is a Ledger Nano, and my private keys are never entered anywhere except the physical device itself, there's basically no reason that I would ever put my private keys anywhere other than the device, and I'm essentially resistant to keylogger attempts by default. Not to mention the Soulflare wallet itself labeled them as scan tokens and actually told me not to interact with them. So ultimately, as you can see, all of my money is still there. See how that works? Crypto companies are often pretty serious about offering security options, but many users are not as enthusiastic about searching them out and using them. You could lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. If you're going to self-custody crypto, and if you have any significant amount of it, you should, security should be something you take as seriously as your actual bank takes it, because ultimately, you are the bank now. This is an advantage that comes with responsibilities. Now, as for NFT marketplaces themselves, that's another story. OpenSea, by far the largest NFT marketplace in existence today, did have an issue with an exploit that allowed some malicious NFT code to drain users' wallets after they opened a pop-up and interacted with their NFTs. Now, I will note that on a site like OpenSea, there is indeed a confirm or reject button that looks like this, and ultimately the same basic low-tech, common-sense security measures do apply. Also in this case, the bug was fixed within an hour of being found. Bug bounties and dedicated cyber security are definitely a boon in situations like these. But the fact remains that security exploits like these are going to pop up from time to time, and there really should be some high-level standardization of how marketplaces and dApps interact with wallets and the types of security that wallets need to provide. Which leads us into that second point that Dan brings up regarding lack of recourse. I'll let him expand a little bit before we continue.
If someone tricks you into sending them your Bored Ape, it's now theirs. The only mechanism in the machine for parsing legitimate transactions from illegitimate transactions is the consensus mechanism, which is only concerned with whether or not the transactions followed the rules of the software.
And here, ladies and gentlemen, is a primary argument I would make about the need for regulation in the crypto market. Kind of like we have regulation in banking, in stocks, in real estate, like every other asset in existence. It's insane to think that simply the concept of blockchain technology will solve all the problem of theft through conventional means that exist in classical digital systems. The whole conversation we had earlier about analog problems in the real world with real people requiring analog solutions with regard to, for instance, input fraud, applies here as well. If we're going to be consistent in our approach to these things, we have to admit that blockchain does not inherently provide the types of consumer protections that we have come to expect from our financial institutions. Of note, banks are largely not the ones providing these assurances. If someone uses your stolen debit card, you're covered by payment services regulations. If someone uses your stolen credit card, you're covered by the Fair Credit Billing Act of 1974. Banks, on the other hand, can actually reject a request to recover your stolen funds on a variety of grounds, with some being as simple as you simply not reporting that incident within a set amount of time, and others being as complex as a investigation concluding that you were negligent in the handling of your account security. That's right, they will absolutely, in every case, try to make it your fault if possible, especially if it's a large amount, which really reinforces the fact that low-tech common sense solutions are kind of not optional, whether you're dealing in crypto or not. Now, even in that situation, if you don't like how your case was handled on the bank's end, you can actually appeal it to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a government agency. If your bank gets hacked, the FDIC insures your account all the way up to $250,000. Same thing for credit unions by way of the NCUA. Currently, if your bankless bank account gets hacked, you're now screwed and you're stuck with that. Now, some of you might be thinking at this point that given the immutable nature of the blockchain, some of this is actually impossible. A couple things about that. So, your accounts are already insured up to $250,000 anyway, so that's not really the big hurdle when it comes to making you whole. Now, while it is indeed impossible to reverse the actual transaction that took the money away from you, it would be very much possible to track the digital trail of said assets and facilitate another transaction, in which case the government would essentially have to just reimburse the cost of the transaction fees, which can be minimized using a chain like Stellar and its XLM token. Indeed, this very thing has been done in at least 2 high-profile cases in the United States alone, one for being about $2 million and another to the tune of $150 million. It can be done, and this expectation should be standard for all consumers, not just big institutions. Regulation is the future, and there are many good reasons that it should be, many of which are covered extensively in the Folding Ideas video. Moving forward a little to Chapter 8, There Is No Privacy on the Chain, I'd say Dan provides a pretty good explanation of some of the basic privacy issues on a public blockchain and how pseudonymous public keys can actually become associated to a certain person through their use of non-anonymous platforms that actually require them to associate their accounts with their names, or just by trading assets that are inherently linked to their names. I also think he does a good job of explaining the cons of a blockchain social network. The idea of a blockchain social network primarily seeks to address the concept of censorship that's coming to the fore in the modern age of social media, with what's happening with Twitter and Trump and stuff like that. Some people simply think that social media companies shouldn't be the arbiter of truth, and they think that with blockchain technology, it takes away that power, even if there is a company associated with the blockchain, which is only potentially conditionally true, honestly. Of course, these are often the same people that argue that, vaccine misinformation should be covered under free speech, and they're against even, a fact check that actually still shows the content, but simply tells people that maybe they should take that content with a grain of salt. Others would argue that a fact check notice like that is the least they can do to, fight misinformation on a platform that they started, but that is an argument that I'm not going to engage with on this video. Now, given that blockchain technology does really nothing to actually stop misinformation, it is, however, a solution that very much favors one side of that argument. And you can imagine who is most likely to adopt a platform like that. The point is that blockchain's immutability is seen as a solution to censorship, but as Dan points out, this essentially just amplifies a lot of the problems with social media as it already stands. And I agree. It's already hard enough to take ownership of your own digital footprint and identity with Web 2. It would be a shame if Web 3 made this even worse, simply because some people didn't like being fact-checked. And ultimately, I don't think that this should become a standard in the realm of social media unless we make some big changes. It would have to be, permissionless, less public. It would be pretty far removed from original cypherpunk ideals or Bitcoin. Just when you thought getting doxxed couldn't get any worse, blockchain says hold my beer.
A lot of this rhetoric stems from a pretty deep failure to understand what a central authority really is, or that you can decentralize data storage while centralizing data. Ethereum is ultimately a central platform, and the fact that a few dozen people need to sign off on every major change before it can be implemented is largely meaningless and symbolic, with the validation network ultimately sitting somewhere between consortium and cartel.
Oh, shots fired. Now, I actually agree with the Ethereum point here. So from an authority and governance standpoint, it actually is kind of just a different centralized setup, and indeed, the same is true for a lot of other larger crypto chains. And actually, on this point, the more I look into it, the more I kind of see where the Bitcoin maxis are coming from, to be honest. Now, let me take a moment to clarify that position a little bit. Now, in the past, I've called Bitcoin maxis meth heads, and I've been fairly dismissive of them at different times in this video and in others, but I should say that philosophically, I'm kind of there with them when it comes to, in the age of Lightning and Taproot. From a decentralization perspective, it doesn't really get better than the Bitcoin network, and it is a bit of a technological dinosaur. But these things do kind of go together. There's a reason for that. Things move extremely, extremely slowly with Bitcoin because it actually is that decentralized. It's hard to get things done. That is an actual consequence of being that purely focused on decentralization. Centralized systems are able to get things done easier and faster. It's kind of like, a democracy versus a dictatorship. If all it takes is one guy has to just say, all right, make this happen. Make it happen, do it this way, do it in this time frame, done. That's a centralized system, right? China can do crazy things weirdly fast, and it's very impressive. But the trade-offs for that are pretty darn significant. Whereas, a lot of democratic nations of similar size take a bit longer to do similar things. It's a similar concept. But the fact remains that from a performance and scalability standpoint, Bitcoin's layer 1 is near the back of the line. But from a security and decentralization standpoint, it is the only philosophically pure chain in existence, and potentially the only one that will be philosophically pure and successful unless Ergo gains traction. If you want to take an in-depth look at how exactly Bitcoin is that decentralized, I'll put a link in the description and you can read a bit further on it. But for now, let's just say that these guys are not kidding when they talk about decentralization. They're not messing around. It is complicated. The lack of a leader to criticize, given Satoshi Nakamoto's anonymity and the freedom from VC funding, make Bitcoin something that is relatively unique and unlikely to be well replicated by anything in the modern age, except, once again, Ergo also mined from nothing and doesn't really have a lot of VC funding. But other than that, Ergo doesn't have much traction right now, so Bitcoin's the successful one. These are the main reasons that any real argument about Bitcoin's full extinction because of a purely, technological standpoint, we're going to have to see that happen first. If layer 2s can save other coins, there's no reason they can't save Bitcoins. Now, I have a lot more to say on this decentralization point, but first...
The network of Ethereum miners and validators are not a formal corporation, yet. There's no mechanism in existence that compels them to act in the interest of users, particularly poor and disempowered users, where those interests conflict with their own. The movement of Ethereum from proof of work to proof of stake has been vaporware in no small part because the validators simply choose not to, because proof of work, volatility, and high gas fees benefit them in the here and now, while proof of stake and low gas fees only benefit them in a hypothetical future.
Now, this one's a little bit more complicated, but honestly, hasn't that been the theme of this whole video? First of all, let me start with a more minor correction. So, proof of stake by itself will eliminate empty blocks and pool payments, as well as getting rid of the uncle block situation, which will theoretically reduce gas fees, but not really by very much at all, because overall block space won't change. But while there won't be the same energy overhead that comes with proof of work mining, minting will actually still allow for gas wars over the same block space as before, and ultimately, hype-led increases in on-chain activity will likely offset any theoretical small reductions to gas fees that this could bring. Any noticeable reduction in gas fees isn't really likely to come until sharding is implemented. The second, much larger point I would say here is the idea that Ethereum has no mechanism by which the developers would be, or validators would be compelled to act in the interests of its users, especially the poorer ones, which I think is pretty debatable there. Sure, there's no on-chain mechanism for this, but take a look at this graph of TVL and tell me if you can spot the off-chain mechanism for keeping validators and developers accountable. See it? No? Alright, fair enough. You kind of need to know what you're looking at, and I haven't really explained myself at all. So let's do that. TVL, or total value locked, is a measure of how much money is locked in smart contracts and DeFi applications on a given chain. It is currently thought of as the major metric of how dominant a smart contract platform is in its space. Just like Bitcoin's market cap dominance used to be 99% of the total market, Ethereum's TVL dominance used to be 99% of smart contract platforms. According to Messari, Ethereum lost over 20% of its dominance in just about 5 months in the first half of 2021. This precipitous drop has so far left Ethereum still the top dog, but anyone with their finger on the pulse at this point knows that this is largely because of first mover effect and the indefinite lockup of funds on the Beacon chain. Gas fees are crushing the network's use, leading it to be thought of as largely a rich person's chain. Ethereum's layer 1 at this point has been surpassed in terms of number of dApps by Polygon, which Ethereum at this point has essentially just kind of gone with the flow in order to take pressure off themselves and keep some control over the narrative, saying that, we will have to expect essentially a mass migration over to layer 2 in the future, because Ethereum layer 1, most crypto projects layer 1, is not really going to scale indefinitely. And there's many arguments to be made that this kind of should be the way that we think about it. That's another discussion. They're not wrong that ultimately global adoption is likely going to require this type of thing long term in order to scale. But what's really striking about this transition is that developers in large applications are not simply going to layer 2s like Polygon as their startup, but large applications are actually migrating from Ethereum layer 1 to large layer 2s like Polygon after having already built up a large base on the layer 1. This speaks to just how big of a difference it is. They're willing to migrate their whole project, and that's kind of a big deal. Ethereum layer 1 right now has almost become kind of a zombie chain that can really only be redeemed through the expeditious implementation of proof of stake and then sharding. One last thing to add before going any further is Metcalfe's law, a model for valuing networks initially like Facebook that's actually become pretty popular in the crypto space for approximating a blockchain's value using number of wallet addresses, which essentially is nodes in the network. It's by no means a proven model of valuation in this regard and leaves a lot to be desired in terms of what it takes into account. But all the same, it is commonly something that people look at whether or not they realize they're looking at it. Investors do look at number of wallets and the growth rate of the number of wallets when they're investing in a new chain, but they don't necessarily think of the words Metcalfe's law when they do so. But that's pretty much what they're looking at. The abandonment of a chain by poor and disempowered users hurts this metric more than anything, as the value varies with the square of the number of nodes in the network. And ultimately, there's pretty much by definition going to be more smaller, poor, and disempowered users versus like whales. Whales are remarkable because of their relative rarity, and if the network they use loses value because nobody's really doing anything with it, all of the liquidity in the world concentrated in the hands of just a few people isn't really going to save the chain if nobody's doing anything with it. Okay, now let's go back to what he said. So he's basically arguing that the incentives actually encourage Ethereum's validators to not allow the difficulty bomb and to drag out the merge to proof of stake as much as they can. While this is likely at play here to some extent, don't get me wrong, the basic problem here is likely a bit simpler. So Occam's razor suggests that the simplest answer is more likely to be correct, and Hanlon's razor suggests that you shouldn't necessarily attribute to malice or bad intentions without proof what can otherwise be attributed to stupidity. Or in this case, likely some technical difficulties, and after those technical difficulties, more than a little bit of hubris. They delayed the difficulty bomb because the merge wasn't ready. Why was the merge not ready? Well, according to Vitalik, it was basically because of years of just major internal conflict. So, truly, blockchain cannot solve the issue of Bill doesn't get along with John. The devs haven't been able to agree on a unified vision for Serenity, and yet still they've been rash enough to continue giving dates for milestones that they weren't actually even close to actually reaching, because they kind of just figured that they would figure it out at some point. Now, this says nothing good about them, and definitely calls their good judgment into account, but doesn't necessarily point toward miners' incentive structure. Indeed, EIP 1559 was an upgrade that was generally opposed by miners because it significantly cut into their fees by simply burning them out of existence to an extent, and so there is precedent for the chain basically going against the miners' incentives and acting in the interest of the project as a whole. Vitalik has put a lot of his own money into the beacon chain to make sure that they reach the goal to actually get the beacon chain to where it is so that they can actually do proof of stake. Also, on a post-EIP 1559 chain, it's no longer clear that these incentives necessarily still align that way. The throughput of the Ethereum chain after proof of stake but before sharding is a matter of a good deal of debate. Nobody seems to really know the exact answer there. But even if all that happens and the network consistently stays near the high end of its performance range, the ETH burn rate could actually make the coin consistently truly deflationary, as opposed to simply mostly disinflationary with periods of deflation. That alone might be worth the trade for people who are actually whales or were miners and will then become minters. Or I'm full of it. That's also possible.
Because these extremely obvious pitfalls are what you get when you let guys like Vitalik Buterin and Elon Musk design the future.
Okay, so this is a bit off topic here, but I minored in philosophy with the concentration of ethics, and I just kind of had to say something about this. Around the hour-and-a-half mark, Dan says something about extremely obvious pitfalls while putting up a thread started by Elon Musk about population collapse, and then Vitalik replied with a thing about artificial wombs. I know this isn't really what we're talking about here at all, but it just irks me to hear this type of dismissiveness applied to what I think is honestly a really interesting and deep conversation if you take a moment to think about it. His original point about pay inequality is actually one of the weakest ones in my estimation. Once you've accounted for a plethora of potential confounding factors, the best estimate I've encountered about the gender pay gap is that women make roughly about 91 cents on the dollar in the United States versus men. This gap actually closes in countries that have culturally moved away from putting the majority of the responsibility for early child rearing on women. And it's widely thought that the unfair distribution of parenting work in many cultures is actually the main driver of this difference. Synthetic wombs could indeed help to reduce this, but the work of changing that culture would remain, and ultimately, if all you did was that, it would have the same effect. There's also the loss of life, health, and money to obstetric complications to account for. Things like preeclampsia, HELLP syndrome, gestational hypertension, gestational diabetes, peripartum cardiomyopathy, postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, uterine abruption, placenta accreta and increta, fetal alcohol syndrome, fetal exposure to diseases and toxins. All of these can potentially be devastating, and many of them are a good bit more common than some people realize. All of these can potentially be eliminated with the use of synthetic wombs. Given that we've long since had the technology to turn skin and blood cells into egg cells, synthetic wombs would also provide a new option for infertile couples and homosexual couples to start families. Then you go ahead and weigh this against the cons. Most people would point to kind of like a Brave New World type scenario here. Would the availability of this type of technology lead to the commodification of life and even the mass production of human life for purposes other than reproduction? At least at first, nobody would bother making babies unless they actually wanted that baby, right? But what happens when the technology becomes more readily accessible and cheaper? How would this be regulated, if at all? Would this affect the role of women in society, making them less valuable with the loss of their ultimate bargain chip, as some feminist thinkers have suggested? How would this affect the emotional relationship between parents and children, if at all? Is being born meaningfully different from being grown if everything after gestation is actually kept the same? After all, people already use surrogates, but presumably they still love those children, right? Not to mention that the technology would have some ramifications to the abortion debate, to say the least. Now, I'm not necessarily arguing the opposite point here, that this type of thing is desirable. And in fact, I'm not really convinced that it is desirable because I don't really trust society to use the technology responsibly, and the potential knock-on effects to society are pretty worrisome. But the treatment of the subject here just irks me for two main reasons. First of all, it seems to dismiss it offhand as if there wouldn't be massive societal benefits that would be worth considering in detail. Reasonable people can disagree on how the pros and cons balance out, but this just feels like we're pretending there aren't any pros at all. Second, the implied answer that this type of thing should be avoided entirely is tantamount to saying, let's not think about this until it comes up. Because it will come up. We were able to produce goats in artificial wombs in 1997. 1997! We were basically cavemen in 1997. Even if this starts as a purely emergency obstetric measure or something to help with fetal surgery or something like that, at some point, this will stop being a sci-fi fantasy thing and start knocking on your front door. Probably within our lifetime at the rate things are going. Look, I don't like it either, but no, let's not talk about that doesn't strike me as a particularly reasonable response, because it's going to happen. The issue is not really whether we should let it happen or not. The issue is, how are we going to handle it when it comes? If the pitfalls are so very obvious, then how about we work on that now, while we still have time? Because any regulations that we make in the moment, once we already have it, is going to be driven by hysteria, and who knows how that will play out. Vitalik's comment simply mentioned a potential benefit, which was a good place to start having a conversation about pros and cons that could have really been productive. Indeed, if you look at the rest of that Twitter thread, there was some decent back and forth. But most media outlets don't really seem to want to go any further than what it takes to get a reaction. Yes, once again, I realize that wasn't really the point of the video, but this example just seems to dismiss a deeper conversation because it's really easy to just have people read it and immediately agree, yeah, Elon and Vitalik are just weirdo clowns that have ideas so absurd that even children can see the problems with them. Now, I have no major problems with Vitalik, honestly. I don't know very much about him, to be honest. But with regard to Elon Musk, if you put his life and decisions and ideas under a microscope, it's frankly utterly baffling and a little confusing and depressing that he's actually made it as far in life as he has. He definitely shouldn't be in charge of anything that shapes the future of humanity. But you can make that point without trivializing what could easily be a deep, meaningful bioethical discussion that you're gonna have to have at some point anyway. Sorry, I just spent multiple years on these types of discussions and I couldn't help myself. End rant.
Things, all these different things, all these parts of your identity, all your economic activity, all the video games you play, all the groups you join, and stick them into one system. That's a central system. It doesn't matter how many different servers that system spans or how many validators need to agree before changes can be made. You've pooled all that data in one place.
So now we return to our conversation about the meaning of decentralization. The TLDR response to this is that this is not really what people mean in the crypto space when they talk about decentralization. Now, this issue, what it means to be decentralized, is a hotly debated one within the space. Go on any message forum and express any viewpoint of the definition of decentralization, and what you'll get is a bevy of Bitcoin maxis, Ethereum maxis, and just about anybody with a keyboard and interest in crypto or blockchain calling you misguided or an idiot or questioning your parentage, slandering your upbringing, and occasionally throwing out racial slurs, and just overall maligning you, while occasionally trying to present their own view of what it means to be decentralized. Just standard internet fare when it comes right down to it. The stuff that we've all come to know and love in Web 2. Couple things to point out here. One is that these views about decentralization are, for some reason, invariably aligned with a very specific outcome, right? The Bitcoin Core people have a view of decentralization that specifically means that Bitcoin is the most decentralized and nothing else can possibly match it. Ethereum maxis have a different view of what decentralization and centralization mean, and they mean that Ethereum is just superior to everything else. And Bitcoin SV, even Bitcoin SV, we went over Tal and how it basically controls the entire chain. Even they have an excuse, a different version of what decentralization means that defends their heavily centralized network. Even they have a version that backs them. Everybody has a version of decentralization that fits their particular agenda, their particular narrative. Dan Olson is not really any different from any of those people. His view is, we'll come back to this at the end, but there is something interesting that we should talk about with regard to it. But at its core, it's not actually that different from what every single chain has. They all have their own idea of what they care about when they talk about decentralization. Somebody who thinks that nothing is really good in the crypto space is going to have a definition of decentralization that is pretty problematic for every chain, and this is exactly what we see. Indeed, what you'll rarely get from these crypto keyboard warriors is this view that if your blockchain becomes too versatile, has too many use cases, gets too much adoption, that this is actually a failure of decentralization that needs to be addressed as such. Compartmentalization of data and processes on the blockchain is definitely an important issue, which is why I said that it's worth talking about. But we don't typically couch that in the language of decentralization. The internet as it is already falls prey to this criticism about centralization and the terrifying interplay between social media networks / search engines and cookies and browsers already exemplifies this issue. The way we hook up payment apps to our bank accounts, or the Google Play Store, or the Apple Play Store, already comes pretty darn close and possibly in some ways exceeds the risks that he sees as in, for instance, MetaMask as a central point of failure. Unfortunately, many crypto projects, like Ethereum for instance, by way of its increasing adoption and success, are headed towards a similar future with potentially exacerbated problems, which I think we're allowed to get as far as they have at this point, simply because I don't think anybody actually expected to get as far as they have as quickly as they have. Even the hyperbulls didn't really plan on getting this far this fast, even though they paid lip service to the idea, right? Otherwise they would have prioritize the implementation and research into necessary infrastructure like sharding and ZK snarks at a much earlier date. They put these things further down the roadmap because they didn't really think they would need to use them right now, but they need them yesterday. On a basic level, the classical cypherpunk ideal of decentralization was all about decentralizing authority and decision making, not really anything else. And Bitcoin objectively does this better than Ethereum. As Folding Ideas pointed out earlier, Ethereum actually fails in decentralizing authority pretty hard, as developers actually have a large amount of control over the network. And instead they do try and focus more on decentralizing compute power. It incorporates things like a Turing-complete scripting language that allows for more use cases and flexibility than Bitcoin's layer 1. This is definitely an important thing to talk about, but really something that deserves its own video.
Now imagine that instead of running a hangout spot in a video game, that I'm a decentralized finance organization giving out mortgages in cryptocurrency, and I scour your transaction history for donations to the NAACP as part of my risk assessment protocol. Imagine that Nestle is able to track unionization efforts in real time because the union is issuing governance tokens on a publicly auditable blockchain.
Great points. And again, issues that are solvable either off-chain or on-chain with alternative blockchain architectures. First of all, such discriminatory practices do already exist in the traditional finance system, and they are absolutely wrong. As I've mentioned earlier, there are no good on-chain solutions to the strictly social aspects of inequality and exploitation in the world of finance that I know of. If anybody else is better acquainted with these types of things and would like to educate us, please let us know in the comments. I'd like to learn more if that does exist, but I don't see good on-chain solutions for this. Again, I would like to more or less defer to regulation as a solution to this, and also point out that this is a bit of a double-edged sword with the examples that he gives. Cryptocurrencies are open source by definition, and just about everyone classifies closed source projects like Internet Computer or Hedera Hashgraph as not really being real crypto. This pretty much translates over into smart contracts as well. If you can go into the code of their smart contracts and just control F NAACP, catching them in the act and bringing legal action against them is easier than ever. And the moment even one person does that and then posts it to TikTok, they're screwed. No matter what the institution's explanation is afterwards, their reputation is dust and their business takes a hit. That evidence of discrimination is indefinitely on the blockchain. If they do it outside of a smart contract, then we're essentially just talking about redlining again, which is a massive, complex problem with no quick fix to my knowledge on or off chain, and it's certainly not fixed by simply using blockchain technology. Again, this is another argument for regulation. The Nestle thing about unionization is definitely a concern, but also a concern that union organizers would immediately be aware of and plan for. For instance, workers at the San Leandro, California distribution center for Amazon are utilizing encrypted blockchain integrated technologies like Keybase to help workers unionize while avoiding the surveillance and oppression seen on platforms like Facebook. Transactions on Keybase are privacy shielded using Zcash, and the platform actually allows workers to digitally sign union authorization cards. So once again, if a problem is this obvious, always consider that maybe other people aren't stupid and have actually started to or have already developed solutions about it.
Using tokens to verify union membership and participate in union activities relies on the tech being oblique enough that union busters and their clients don't see it as a meaningful arena to monitor. Also, that ship has already sailed. Union busters and gig economy evangelists love crypto. They love DeFi and they love smart contracts and they love NFT.
Citation needed. That's all I'll say. I've spent a few hours trying to substantiate these claims that all these groups just love all of the things that he just talked about. And truly I did. Comment below if you'd like to help me with that. Maybe I can just do an addendum video to this. But honestly, even if they did love them, it's very possible that they're a little misguided as well. Because once again, there are solutions to their entry into the space with regard to how union workers can unionize without their interference while using blockchain technology. We just talked about that. Next, I'm just going to play for you a section of the original video that I actually completely agree with and couldn't really have said it better myself.
Deflation counterintuitively means the line is going up, which makes it look like a good thing, but it's only good if you already have the currency in hand. As the purchasing power of a currency increases, typically because cash gets more scarce, the cost of goods and labor goes down. A deflationary economy punishes buying things, as anything that you buy today will inevitably be cheaper to buy in the future. If you need to buy things that aren't financial assets, things that don't appreciate in value, like food, clothing, rent, vehicles, transit fare, you screw yourself over. This is hyperdeflation, and it's not only designed into cryptocurrencies with their hard cap on total coin supply, but considered desirable by their creators and evangelists. This is what going to the moon means.
This is exactly why a highly deflationary currency really shouldn't be used as medium of exchange on the level of a whole economy. Now, some economists have argued that smaller rates of deflation, maybe even 2-3% a year consistently, might potentially be okay, but only if you can guarantee it doesn't go any further past that. There's a reason the Fed intentionally targets a 2 to 3% inflation rate. It's not because they just couldn't possibly do it, it's because it's classically seen as not desirable. Now, there's actually a few reasons this is bad. And one, like Folding Ideas mentioned earlier, is that by slowly, or not slowly, increasing the purchasing power of an asset over time, you actually disincentivize spending. Why would I spend this dollar now when I can buy twice as much for that same dollar in a couple of months? It's dumb to do that. I should hold on to it and not spend it. This decreases the velocity of money in an economy, and ultimately that hurts businesses because money is not changing hands, and especially small businesses. And this leads to a contraction in the economy. That's why deflationary monetary policy is thought of as contractionary policy. The second reason, and this is becoming a more relevant consideration every single day, is the horrific effect that large amounts of deflation would have on debtors. And who might that be? Well, these days, pretty much everyone. Everyone from students taking out large student loans that they can't yet repay, to homeowners taking out multi-decade mortgages, to nation states with large amounts of debt compared to their GDP on their balance sheets. Everyone. Deflation, especially at high rates, can be an existential threat to everyone that has large debt. And if you happen to be a business that sells goods that are denominated in a deflationary currency, your prices are dropping, and therefore your revenues are dropping, and your ability to repay your debts is going down over time. If this happens, the idea is that the economy would essentially collapse on every imaginable level, which is a problem. We really should call the deflationary ones crypto assets and not cryptocurrencies, because ultimately we shouldn't want them for that. Use them as a reserve asset in treasuries? Sure. Put them in your investment portfolio? Sure. Use them for transactions if you feel like it while building out an infrastructure for the unbanked? Sure. As long as regularly audited and over-collateralized stablecoins are readily available. But requiring businesses to accept them as legal tender while transitioning an entire economy to a deflationary currency en masse? I mean, that's a dangerous game. In a smaller economy with a more modest debt to GDP ratio, you might be able to get away with that if you focus on building out your infrastructure. And given that this is a new experiment entirely that's never been tried before, that's a big maybe. Lastly, I want to address something that was mentioned multiple times in the Folding Ideas video.
Evangelists will counter.
Evangelists Will Say. This, I assume, was his attempt at steelmanning the opposition, which ultimately I don't think quite functioned in that way. The evangelist positions that he presents are often incomplete and or extreme, with emphasis on the extreme. Now, if you go to crypto Twitter, these perspectives are actually so easy to find and so prominently quoted by the community at large that you'd be forgiven for thinking that these might be the best arguments that the space has to offer. But I contend that the more extreme views are pretty much always the weakest arguments in any given space. Christian extremists might talk about how young earth creationism is the only belief consistent with the actual text of the Bible. Right-wing extremists might contend that libertarianism is the only just way to rule. And crypto extremists, or evangelists here, might claim that Bitcoin solves everything. These positions are admittedly held by many in the space. Even some very prominent members of the space are widely, quoted as having said things like that. But in my opinion, they are by no means the strongest arguments or positions that you can take. So while he has by no means argued against positions that no one is taking, and in that sense is not fighting a straw man, he's also not necessarily fighting the steeliest man he could, so to speak. But maybe the point was to address popular opinions as opposed to the strongest opinions, in which case he would have accomplished what he set out to do. I can't really speak to his intentions, honestly, but what I would say is that he's likely arguing in good faith, and I really do appreciate a well-thought-out critique of crypto like his, even though I disagree with the large majority of what he said. I mean, from my perspective, if all it took was for somebody to point out obvious potential issues like a lot of the ones presented, to undermine my investment thesis, then that probably wouldn't have been a very good investment thesis to begin with. But, writing a more than 50-page response like this has definitely helped me add some nuance and details to that thesis, which I appreciate the opportunity for.
Throughout the video, I've tried to stick to facts as much as possible, but I have peppered in a lot of my own opinions and observations. So it needs to be asked, what are my biases? How reliable am I as an educator in the space? Well, pretty much all of my recent content has been crypto related, although this is not technically a strictly crypto channel. Also, the majority of my liquid assets are actually in crypto. So not only is my YouTube presence largely centered on crypto, but a great deal of my actual net worth is in crypto assets. Now, some caveats there. So my YouTube presence at this point is minuscule, so at least in my opinion, this is a bit less of a problem simply because I could pivot to just about any other type of video pretty easily. I mean, admittedly, it would present some issues with the algorithm if it was too different outside like the finance space, but I could do it. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. And I'm acutely aware that, my own investments are going to be a factor in how I approach the market and what things I choose to talk about. This is why I make an attempt to be as transparent as possible about the relationship between my money and my mouth. It should be noted that Bitcoin and Ethereum are really the only two major projects that have always set new all-time highs after every major downturn since they've gotten into the top 10, which of course for Bitcoin is since the very beginning. The top 10 list has changed constantly throughout the last decade, but Bitcoin has always been number one, and Ethereum, ever since it got into the top 10, has always been number two, except for the 1 year where XRP actually flipped it. That did actually happen. So Ripple's XRP is the only one that's ever taken that number two spot other than Ethereum. Now, the vast majority of the crypto market's gains in the last decade have been actually concentrated in really just these two coins, and despite them being dinosaurs as far as layer ones go, they are the most battle-tested projects in existence. Other coins in my portfolio include major players in the metaverse, Oracle, blockchain interoperability, and smart contract platform spaces, with a preference for highly actively developed layer one projects. By dollar amounts, I do tend to stick to the large caps in the top 20, with the large majority of my money being in the top 10. I am comfortable putting some of my money on riskier plays that show promise from a technological, financing, and or partnership perspective. But these are always in a minority for me. I consider myself an investor and not a trader so much, and from what I've seen in the crypto market, adoption and active development are indispensable for long-term outlook, and these things tend to be found most reliably in the top 10 coins by market cap. Surprisingly, out of these three elements, tech, financing, and partnerships, it actually seems that current technology is probably the weakest predictor of long-term staying power. This is likely a reflection of how entrenched large players affect the market, despite having the oldest tech and the unhealthy gambling atmosphere that's invaded the crypto market. And let's talk about that for just a little bit. It's something that Folding Ideas brought up multiple times, and I think is very important to address. There's no denying that there's a large gambler crowd in the crypto space, and the culture of cryptocurrency encourages this type of thinking unashamedly. More than one of the songs featured in the chapter title screens from The Problem with NFTs features rappers prominently referring to themselves as degens or degenerate gamblers. This is something I find deeply unfortunate. I will say that it is not unique to the space, as certain niches of the stock market with esoteric technicals, the high possibility of catastrophic loss, and the potential for astronomic gains, like for instance biotechnology, also have these features. But it's something I don't like seeing all the same. It makes it harder for someone like me to actually engage with the community because the majority of them really don't think like investors at all. Dan Olson's evaluation of these people is often not far off the mark, unfortunately. And I hope that as the space matures, we see less of this, but I mean, we'll see. The fact remains that just because you can gamble on something doesn't mean that it's only good for gambling. Penny stocks are not the stock market. Moving on, I am admittedly not a computer science or cryptography specialist, and I hold no delusions about being the best person to communicate the detailed technical aspects of cryptography and programming and the algorithms that are used to the masses. Whenever possible, I've tried to use primary and secondary sources with care to capture the spirit of what they convey, and at times lifting their sentences wholesale to make sure that I don't misrepresent what I'm citing. This is also why I didn't try to go into painstaking detail about the limitations of cryptographic privacy preservation when we talked about healthcare records or unions. Pretty much everything I know in terms of details comes from a University of Pennsylvania capstone thesis I found approachable, which I will link in the description. Cryptography is not a magic bullet for privacy, and even platforms like Zcash or even Monero are not, at least theoretically, not foolproof. But you'll need someone else to explain the computer science to you if that's really your thing. So where do I think the market is going? All kinds of places. Historically, the prevailing narrative surrounding crypto assets has shifted many times, and as we see in these graphs of Bitcoin and Ethereum narratives over time, as the name suggests, a decentralized currency replacement is how everything got started. Since then, we've seen the rise and fall of multiple narratives regarding use cases, with Bitcoin's store of value / gold 2.0 function and Ethereum's smart contract / dApp functionality taking center stage for the longest period since their inception. These functions seem to be dominating the space right now and don't seem likely to be going away anytime soon. Bitcoin is rather unique in its lack of an identifiable founder to critique and its true decentralization, its philosophical purity and disconnection from that dirty VC money. These attributes are effectively or close to impossible to replicate in the modern market, with Ergo coming as close to any project I've actually seen. The need to scale Bitcoin with pretty much exclusively layer 2 solutions might seem like a disadvantage at first, but the argument can be made that this allows you to avoid that tragedy of the commons problem, wherein every new project built to directly use Ethereum's layer 1 strains the entire system, leading to network-wide knock-on effects if even a single dApp gets overloaded. The maintenance of Bitcoin's original layer 1 structure focuses on security and decentralization, which would then allow these layer 2 solutions to inherit many of these desirable attributes if implemented well. Bitcoin's layer 1 does not feature Turing-complete smart contract language and likely never will. This is actually seen as a feature and not a bug, because the decreased expressivity of any scripting done on, layer 1 Bitcoin it allows for less considerations when doing things for like security. At this point, the proof of work aspect is really the biggest unknown in the current market. Of the top 10 coins right now, Bitcoin is really the only one that is proof of work that plans to stay that way. The entire market has migrated to proof of stake en masse this cycle, citing scalability and sustainability concerns. Proof of stake does not have nearly the track record of proof of work, and we have yet to see how it holds up, especially in the face of large-scale adoption. There are a variety of trade-offs when it comes to proof of stake, and it'll be up to the market to decide how worthwhile these trade-offs end up being in the long term. Now, if the top 10 are hit by a series of high-profile hacks for whatever reason, we could see a collapse in the liquidity in virtually the entire crypto market, aside from maybe Bitcoin. A scenario that would also potentially lead to another parabolic Bitcoin run, and just as everyone kind of retreats to a proof of work chain, a blow-off top for the ages. If something like that doesn't happen, Bitcoin's energy requirements and how its layer 2 solutions affect its utility will come under increasing scrutiny. If we can get past 50% renewables used for proof of work mining in the next few years, then the road to carbon neutrality should be pretty clear given the extremely favorable trends in renewable energy prices. My investments in Cadena and Ergo are explicitly for hedging against proof of stake. The specter of stablecoin collateralization fraud continues to loom large, and how that plays out, whether regulation comes before or after the collapse of the stablecoin market, is going to potentially be a deciding factor in how crypto assets are viewed in the near to midterm future. This, in my eyes, is one of the more likely causes of the next potential crypto winter, with the others being, the global debt bubble bursting, or the start of a large-scale war between the United States and even one other major world power. Obviously, I'm thinking of Ukraine and Russia right now, but who knows where America's next war will come from. For a more extensive look at the risks in crypto right now, please take a look at my video in the top right if you want to know more. Most importantly, is there a zero scenario somewhere in the future? Could the entire market go to zero at some point? In short, no, probably not. Not in this lifetime. If we continue the cycle of boom and bust that we've seen over the last dozen years plus, we may see another, 80% drop at some point as we enter another crypto winter. Now, this may be avoidable given the veritable ocean of institutional money that's flown into the market recently, but this is by no means guaranteed. There may be winters and times of reckoning in the future. Indeed, I'd count on it until time proves me wrong. However, I don't see an actual zero scenario happening this far into the game. Now then, what lessons do I think we should learn from what's already happened in the world of crypto? One, don't fall in love with your bags. If something goes up, consolidate profits. If a project's fundamentals change, be open to selling. You have to stay true to investing principles, not the projects that you buy. Having conviction is all well and good, but you can't catch a falling knife if adoption and development aren't progressing, or if serious technological holes are exposed. You have to have endpoints of when you sell and buy in, or at least preset times when you'll reevaluate and rebalance your portfolio for very long-term investors like myself. Two, for the love of God, take security seriously. You are the bank, so you need to be as serious as your bank. They have men with guns in armored cars transporting your money. They have multi-signature access vaults and accounts. Now, you can't do all of that, but you can definitely attempt to approximate some of the more important measures that they use. Past a certain amount in assets, you should really seriously consider securing your bags with a cold wallet. And if you're a serious high roller, things like Shamir secrets sharing schemes and multi-sig accounts are good ideas for even more extreme security. Some of those extra measures can actually even help you guard against, those $5 wrench attacks. I am a huge proponent of cold storage. Not only is having air-gapped access to your keys the ultimate security measure, but the added friction forces you to take a bit of extra time to think through your investments each time you do one. You have to actually go and get your physical device and unlock it and hook it up and sign the transfer. For most people with hundreds of dollars in crypto or crypto super users who really lean into DeFi, I think hard wallets are non-negotiable. Once you have six figures in the market, you probably don't want to have more than maybe $150K associated with a single hardware wallet. By the way, I don't typically give financial advice, but that right there is financial advice. Take security seriously. Especially if you're in the crypto world, you have to take security seriously. I'm going to say it again just for emphasis. Take security seriously. It can't be an afterthought. In crypto, nobody is going to take care of that for you.
And there you have it. Lots of misleading, incomplete, and sometimes outright wrong ideas in a 2-hour plus video that at the time of recording is past 6 million views. Now, I don't have nearly as eloquent of an exit speech prepared for this video as Folding Ideas did, because frankly, based on my channel's performance metrics, there's precisely zero chance that anybody has made it this far into the video. I'm just talking to myself in front of a camera right now. I know that. My average watch time is like 12 seconds because of the shorts on the channel, and even before the shorts it was not that great. So, knowing that, let's just, I guess, qualify the whole video before I sign off. I am by no means the most well-informed person in the space. I don't doubt that my own perspectives are incomplete and have blind spots, just like in the Folding Ideas video. I may have even made some of the same mistakes that he did. The longer I'm in the space, the more I realize how little I know. I'm always finding new people that have a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the crypto world, and it's always humbling to go from thinking that you know what you're talking about to realizing that you've been a blind idiot, no better than those you've been criticizing. I don't want to give anyone the impression that this video is the final say on anything I talked about, because there's no possible way that it is. The mining and sustainability discussion, for instance, is definitely a topic you could go deeper with, and there's more back and forth to be had. That conversation alone could have had an extra hour or two in the video. But the final page count is 53, and while that shouldn't have taken so long to write, I kept rewatching Folding Ideas videos, and I started watching H Bomber Guy videos, and then I started rewatching Sean videos, and then I remembered I was working on my own video, and long story short, this took 3 weeks longer than I had to because I get distracted easily. So, if we can get this to like 7 views with even like 5 minutes watch time, that would actually be a record for me. So, there you go. Feel free to tell me why I'm evil and stupid in the comments. And after that, don't forget to like the video and then subscribe to me on OnlyFans. And I'll see you in the next one.
HFSP, have fun staying poor.